Good morning, everyone. We are thrilled to have so many of you hopping on this morning for the Virginia Early Literacy Summit. My name is Holly Coy. I work at the Department of Education, and I have the pleasure of kicking us off this morning. So while folks are still coming in, I just wanted to do a quick logistical rundown and let you know a couple of things about the logistics of this webinar before we jump in with the amazing content that's been queued up by our partners this morning. A couple of things for your awareness. The event is being recorded this morning, and it will be shared via the Early Literacy Summit website after the event. It is also being live streamed on YouTube, and it is accessible on the UVA School of Education and Human Development YouTube channel. So if you have friends or colleagues who tried to register but found that registration was closed, feel free to send them to that UVA School of Ed YouTube channel, and they can check it out there this morning. Because we're in webinar mode and because we are so many of you have joined us, which we are thrilled about, there is no video or audio from attendees this morning. And what that means is if you've got questions or technical issues, we need you to submit those issues and questions other ways. So throughout the content and throughout the summit this morning, we'll be taking Q&A from you at the end of a couple of different segments. And the way to submit questions for that is by using the Q&A box that you will find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if you click on that Q&A box, you'll be able to submit a question, and we'll be pulling questions out of there and sharing them back with our presenters so that they can answer them throughout the morning. The other piece of that is that if you're having any technical issues this morning, the best thing to do is to send a chat to Kelly Bloom, B-L-O-E-M. Kelly is our Zoom expert this morning, and she'll be happy to troubleshoot with you if you get hung up on anything. So questions go in the Q&A function. Technical issues can go to Kelly Bloom in the chat function. So with that, we're thrilled to kick off a wonderful morning of content for you from a variety of experts. I have the pleasure this morning of introducing you to our first speaker, Virginia's Secretary of Education, Atif Carney. And prior to his appointment as Governor Northam's Secretary of Education, Atif taught at Belleville Middle School in Prince William County, teaching courses in civics, economics, U.S. history, and even math. In addition to his work as an educator, he is a former sergeant in the United States Marine Corps and was deployed to Iraq in 2003 during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Secretary Carney has a bachelor's in sociology from George Washington University, as well as a master's in history and teaching license from George Mason University. So it is my absolute pleasure this morning to introduce you to my friend, my former boss, and the Commonwealth Secretary of Education, Atif Carney.
Good morning, Holly. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you for your leadership in all that you do. Good morning to everyone on this terrific Tuesday morning. Thank you so much for joining us at the 2020 Early Literacy Summit. It is so good to have all of you here at this annual event sponsored by our wonderful partners at the UVA School of Education and Human Development, the Virginia Association of School Superintendents, the UVA K-12 Advisory Council, VA, SCD, and of course our wonderful Department of Education. I'm so grateful that you have taken the time to spend your morning with us here today, and I know that this program we have queued up will be an immense value to all of us and your practice as leaders in your schools and school divisions. It may seem obvious, but I don't think it can be overstated that early literacy is the foundation to a student's learning and success. It is perhaps one of the most critical skills we develop in our students, and the expertise offered here today will help all of us approach this topic with the latest science and research. It is my pleasure this morning to introduce to a friend of mine and a colleague, the Dean of the UVA School of Education and Human Development, Dr. Bob Pianta. As many of you already know, Dean Pianta is an internationally recognized expert in both early childhood education and K-12 teaching and learning. He has led research and development on measurement tools and interventions that help teachers interact with students more effectively and that are used widely in the US and around the globe. Dean Pianta received his bachelor's and master's in special education from the University of Connecticut and his PhD in psychology from the University of Minnesota. He began his career as special education teacher and joined the University of Virginia faculty in 1986, and then he became dean in 2007. We are so thrilled to partner with the UVA School of Education and Human Development on this annual summit and appreciate Dean Pianta and his team sharing their expertise with us on this topic today. Dean Pianta, I'd like to turn it over to you. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Secretary Carney, for that gracious introduction, for your partnership over the years, your support of this summit and each of our prior annual summits. I also want to offer a special thanks to the Summit Planning Committee, particularly Holly Coy, Stuart Roberson, Ben Kaiser, and Lori McCullough for their commitment to this effort and the terrific collaboration. Also thanks to the K-12 Advisory Council and its partnership with the UVA School of Education and Human Development, to the Virginia Department of Education, the Virginia Association of School Superintendents, and VA SCD for their partnership. Also appreciation to my colleagues, Emily Solari and Anita McGinty, for providing important content for today's discussion, to our panelists and Jenna Conway for moderating, to Dr. James Lane for his leadership and participation in today's event, and to the terrific staff across so many organizations for making these plans real. And thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. It's a great pleasure and really a terrific credit to the professionalism and commitment of so many educators across the Commonwealth that you're joining us this morning. I want to start by sharing a personal reflection as we think about the theme of today's summit, early literacy and the science of reading. I graduated from the University of Connecticut with a degree in special education in 1978. And while a student there, I took a course in psycholinguistics, not a term I was familiar with Professor Donald Shankweiler. And that course changed my view about the potential links between science and educational practice. This course explained the connection between spoken and written forms of language and how the skill of reading, the decoding of words, and then eventually their understanding was rooted in processing the sounds and utterances of our language system. That this skill was not primarily or solely a visual process, but rather an oral one that involves speech and the understanding of sounds. We read dozens of studies documenting careful experimentation, and it was quite clear even to me that this work had tremendous implications for the teaching of reading. I also, in my education courses, took classes with Isabel Liberman, in which these concepts were more clearly linked to children's problems in learning how to read and to the teaching of reading. And then I taught special education in classrooms using methods and curricula and assessments derived from this work. Little did I know, more than 40 years ago, that I had taken courses in the science of reading. And little did I know that this science would end up controversial, or even worse, sometimes not attended to, in how we prepare teachers, how we develop curricula, and how we teach or assess young children. In fact, the next time I came across or was reminded of this work was when I started doing research in early childhood classrooms, and one of the sites was in a state that had mandated a whole language approach to teaching reading. And there was major controversy at the time around, do we teach phonics, do we teach whole language, as if students did not need to be taught explicitly how to decode words. It was as if the science that I had learned, and that science that had continued to build over time, making connections between learning to read and brain development, or the understanding of disability, and the cognitive psychology, that science didn't exist. So we fast forward to today, when the science of reading is a term we use to describe this accumulated knowledge base, derived from rigorous and often experimental research, and that in many ways has continued from those studies I read as an undergrad. This term reminds us that we actually do know something about how reading develops, about the conditions that enable it to develop, and the conditions that inhibit it. We know the importance of children learning from the very youngest age, the sounds of language and the verbalization of meaning in words and phrases. and then the explicit mapping of those sounds to an orthography, to print in smaller and larger units. And we have curricula that sequence systematic exposure to activities and experience that lead to children's success in mastering this connection between spoken sounds and written words. I would argue that despite the challenges we have in ensuring that children do learn to read, we know more about the development and teaching of early literacy than almost any other area of education. My wife, who is also an educator, reminds me that education is one of those fields in which if you don't like something, just wait because the pendulum will swing back in the other direction soon enough. Unfortunately, I think she's right too many of the times. And all too often, we do not stay the course and build on existing knowledge using strong scientific approaches combined with the practical application knowledge that comes from using those approaches in classrooms. Well, maybe the pendulum has swung back to what I was learning 40 years ago, or maybe we truly are now recognizing the validity of this science of reading for our work in classrooms. And either way, I think it's a good thing we're doing this. Today's summit is an opportunity to re-immerse ourselves in the science of reading and its implications for teaching and learning in the Commonwealth's classrooms. As such, I hope it is the next phase of a systematic, programmatic, and concerted effort to bring this knowledge out across the state and to support every educator, child, and parent in how to best use what we know as each does their best to promote early literacy. I'm hopeful that through this summit and associated efforts in curriculum and professional development, that we can truly strengthen opportunities for every child to be a successful young reader. Now let me introduce our first speaker of the morning, my colleague, Dr. Emily Solari. Dr. Emily Solari is a professor of reading education and coordinator of the reading education program at the School of Education and Human Development at the University of Virginia. Dr. Solari's research focuses on better understanding reading development and subgroups of learners who are at risk for reading difficulties and those identified with reading disabilities, with the goal of developing and implementing evidence-based language and reading instruction and interventions. Her scholarship includes experimental studies, professional development studies, and evaluations of reading interventions and programs in school settings. Her work is largely focused on developing teacher knowledge to understand why some students experience difficulties learning to read and testing the efficacy of evidence-based reading interventions implemented by classroom teachers in school settings. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Solari to the presentation, and I know you'll all be interested in what she has to say. Emily, it's yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Dean Pianta, for that generous introduction. And you've actually set me up quite nicely for what I'm about to talk to the group about, so I really appreciate that. I also want to thank the Planning Committee for inviting me to speak today. I'm honored to be here to speak about one of my most favorite topics, reading development and reading education. So if you don't mind, I'd like to take a quick moment for us to reflect on where we are as a Commonwealth and a nation in the midst of a pandemic and a new awakening of the recognition of deep racial and socioeconomic divides, which very clearly have an impact on our educational system. I gave a talk on the science of reading to stakeholders in Virginia just this past February, which was a mere 8 months ago, which is often hard to believe because so much has happened since then. This was, of course, pre-COVID. NAEP scores across the country had been recently released with disappointing results for Virginia and more broadly across the country, and reading was in the spotlight. The 2019 NAEP scores dropped in most states, not all, but most, and perhaps most concerning was no improvement for children demonstrating reading difficulties, with children below the 50th percentile showing the greatest drop in scores for the 2019 NAEP outcomes. NAEP results have also consistently revealed that nearly half of our students of color and students from low-income families begin fifth grade with skills that are below basic level. So this means that millions of children enter fifth grade and lack the basic reading skills necessary to make simple inferences from text when they're reading. This is problematic because we know that literacy is a early literacy has impact on lifelong outcomes. So such outcomes such as high school graduation rates, civic engagements, and health outcomes. So we know that early literacy development is really important. Thanks to the dedicated and talented reporters, the stories of reading instruction across the nation have surfaced over the past 18 months to 2 years. Stories of teacher struggles to get adequate training and professional development to teach children how to read, of family struggles to access to adequate early screening and reading intervention. Moreover, there has been a specific attention drawn to teacher preparation programs not adequately preparing teachers to teach reading, and the multiple failures in bridging the research base to practice. Further, there was an attention drawn to improving reading outcomes for children with a specific focus on vulnerable and underserved populations of children. So as Bob alluded to just a few minutes ago, reading instruction is controversial. So for many folks in the reading world, including myself, this recent attention to reading was and continues to be welcomed. Some popular media and social media outlets spoke of a reignited, quote unquote, reading wars. But most of us know, if you've been doing this work for many years, that those discussions and wars and level of controversy never went away. And yes, reading and literacy are very controversial, and often, in my opinion, unnecessarily so. Some of the topics that you have seen appear on this slide are what we call hot button issues. Back in the time when I was able to go to my office to work, I have a large whiteboard with all of these terms, plus many more in my office that I look at every single day. And I keep it there so that when faculty or students come into my office to discuss reading and the controversy around reading, or the work our team has been putting into advancing the way we are teaching reading, we can engage in these conversations around these terms. I believe that the controversy around reading is primarily a communication, training, and semantics issue. Sometimes we are saying the same word, but it means very different things to general education or special education or reading education. Importantly, nobody has full ownership of reading. In fact, instruction of reading transcends general education and special education. And the silos we often fit ourselves into do more damage than good when we are thinking about child level achievement. Importantly, you would be hard pressed to find an educator who does not want to get reading right for kids. So while having these conversations can be difficult, they are also important if the goal is to sustain change and improvement. I won't have time to address all of these terms today, but very happy to engage with folks on these at a later date. Many of us are aware of the numerous state level legislative mandates around reading. Most of these mandates have been pushed by tireless and determined parent advocates, who should be acknowledged as our partners and collaborators in ensuring children receive adequate reading instruction. Virginia is not alone in these state level legislation. So every state that you see here highlighted in blue has some form of state level legislation around dyslexia, whether it be about screening, intervention practices, or pre-service teacher training, or all three. In many ways, the issues in reading education are just the same as they were in February and have been for several decades. But as we talk about early literacy and reading today, we cannot ignore that the world has shifted and some of the issues we discussed pre-COVID have been exacerbated. Before COVID, there were notable opportunity gaps based on race and class, and these led to what we commonly call the achievement gap. This has been present as long as we have been tracking and reporting on educational achievement in this country. When schools closed and moved to remote learning this past spring, inequities that were brewing just below the surface suddenly boiled over for all of the nation to see. Of course, the people listening to this talk are the most familiar with this. Our educational system and its inequities have been put on full display in a way that we have not experienced for many years. And administrators, teachers, and staff have responded through enormous efforts. I personally witness these efforts every single day in my home. I have 3 elementary age sons that are enrolled in virtual schooling. But the reality is that some of our students are differentially negatively impacted by school closures, in-person school closures due to COVID. In early literacy and reading, there have been some papers starting to come out about the impact of learning loss. One of our colleagues, Dr. Jim Solon at UVA, has led a study looking at projections of literacy loss for different groups of kids. And the projections really show us that the kids who were suffering the most, had the most difficulty learning how to read pre-COVID, are the ones who will be most likely most negatively impacted when we all go back to normal schooling, whatever that will look like. So I want to bring this just briefly back to the Virginia context. So we're actually quite fortunate to have a solid framework from which to provide children with scientifically based early literacy instruction in Virginia. For over 20 years, Virginia has had a system of screening for children who are at risk for reading difficulties and funding streams to provide supplemental reading intervention to those who are identified. The framework already exists in the Commonwealth, and it is important to note that this framework is unique. Most students do not have similar funded systems. However, the existence of a framework does not mean that it is being implemented to its fullest potential. And I think that, quite frankly, as educators, we should at times take a critical lens to our existing systems to determine if they are serving students in the way that they were intended. State level data are showing us that the system is not functioning as it was intended. Just a cursory glance at reading SOL data show inequities in reading outcomes across race, class, and disability status. And while state level reading assessments are imperfect measures of achievement, they do provide what I like to call a pulse on what is happening at a systems level, and they do present some truths. The data make it clear that improving the system is a matter of equity. So I have three main goals of my talk today, of my brief amount of time with you. I'm going to talk to you about the scientific evidence base in reading and how we can use it to enhance the existing framework to better serve our teachers and their students. I apologize, there's someone ringing our doorbell. I'm hoping that the talk today will allow us to envision ways in which we can cut through the noise or the controversy around reading and literacy instruction and dedicate our efforts to serving teachers and students in the way they ought to be served. So as we go through today, I want you to really think about a child or student that you have known that has encountered reading difficulties or learning to read. As educators, we all know at least one child in this situation. And even those of us who spent our careers in secondary school know children who arrived in secondary school without adequate word reading skills and reading comprehension skills. So let's think about how we can change our practice and policies, both at the division and school level, to better serve these students. Okay, so Virginia NAEP scores from 1992 to 2009. Reading just sort of mirrors what we see across the nation, that the scores in Virginia have been stagnant, despite numerous policy shifts and mandates around reading. So this orange line represents the largest scale national reading initiative in recent memory, Reading First, which occurred in the early 2000s. It also represents when the Early Intervention and Reading Initiative, so EIRI, was implemented in Virginia. Also, during this time, there were several key reviews of the literature base around the evidence base for early literacy instruction. First, the National Reading Panel and the National Early Literacy Panel. And there had been other reports on evidence base dating back to the mid-1960s. So we have a solid evidence base, as Bob alluded to, in reading instruction and how reading develops in the brain. There was another important report in 1998 from the National Academy of Sciences that really concentrated on struggling readers. So what do we need to do for struggling readers? All of the reports dating back to the 60s, 1960s, had very similar findings and highlighted the importance of systematic and explicit phonics instruction for early word reading development. And also some of the reports highlighted the importance of high quality language instruction to develop adequate word reading. So it's important to know that there was a lot of research done before the National Reading Panel, and that research has continued since that time. So there has been, in the past 20 years, There has been more research related to reading development. So the evidence base is not new. We have known about the science of reading for years. We may not have called it the science of reading for years, but we have certainly known about the science of reading for years. There is converging evidence over many decades that has established the scientific evidence base. And importantly, it's not just a list of things that we need to be doing. It's an approach to learning, it's an approach to teaching, and ways that we should be implementing different strategies around reading. And we know that explicit and systematic instruction of both foundational skills, so teaching children how to decode words, and simultaneous with language and meaning-based instruction, is what kids need to know in order to comprehend what they're reading. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the neurological model of reading, the brain-based science, but what I would like to say is that this research base has really evolved in recent years. On this graphic, on the top, what you'll see is what we knew in the mid-1960s about brain-based, about how we know the brain works to develop reading. And the bottom graphic represents what we currently know. What we currently know about different areas of the brain and which areas are activated during reading. So it shows you how far we have come since the mid-60s. And what you will see is that there are different areas of the brain that are activated when an individual sees a word, when they are pronouncing a word, when they are connecting letters to sounds and written letters and words, and when they are trying to make meaning from text. Research has also shown us that children who have reading disabilities such as dyslexia have brain differences. Notably, these individuals have reduced activation in the areas of the brain implicated in reading language. So what does the science of reading tell us? First, and importantly, learning to read is not a natural process. It has to be explicitly taught. It's not like language development. So most people are born with the ability to develop language and communicate with other people orally. As such, children enter formal schooling with vocabulary or words that they know the meaning of orally. We know that there's a large variation in vocabulary levels at pre-kindergarten and kindergarten entry, but most children enter school with some oral language. However, children need to be explicitly taught how those words are represented in written language. When individuals become skilled readers, they are able to automatically recognize words, but for most people, this comes after multiple exposure to written words and an understanding of the relationship between letter sounds and letter names. We also know that reading comprehension is the ultimate goal of reading, and decoding, while it's essential for comprehension, it's not sufficient alone. So most educators have encountered students who can fluently read text, but despite this, have a hard time understanding or comprehending what they are reading. So we know that language is also very important for reading comprehension. So this was defined, the simple view of reading dates back to 1986. So again, this body of literature that was built before the National Reading Panel findings came out in 2000. And the simple view of reading basically says that reading comprehension is the product of decoding and linguistic comprehension. And what we mean is that both of those things, so decoding or word reading and linguistic comprehension or oral language, are both necessary for reading comprehension. And importantly, it's really important to also note that, like I said, reading is not a natural process. So kids don't just know how to decode. They have to be explicitly taught how to decode. So underneath this sort of decoding component skill that's really important for reading comprehension, there's a whole slew of other skills that are precursors to decoding that develop basically essentially from birth. So these skills are developing over time in young children. And it's the same for linguistic comprehension. So vocabulary and language develops from a very, very young age. So these things are developing before kids enter formal schooling. Another way that folks think about this is in 2001, Hollis Scarborough put out the reading rope, and this is very widely used across the country and across many countries actually, to look at how language comprehension, so the different subcomponent skills under language comprehension that have to develop, so for our oral language, background knowledge, vocabulary, knowledge of language structures, verbal reasoning, and literacy knowledge, and word recognition, so that would be the decoding side, phonological awareness, decoding, and sight word recognition. All of these things develop over time, and they become increasingly strategic and increasingly automatic over time as kids develop, and they're both necessary for successful reading comprehension. Importantly, the simple view of reading has been empirically validated in multiple subgroups of children. And I know that I don't have all of the citations here. So there have been studies done with English language learners that show that both linguistic comprehension and decoding are predictive of reading comprehension. It's been done with children with early profiles of risk, children with disabilities, including children with autism and also ADHD. So there is a convergence of literature with different subgroups of kids showing that the simple view of reading is relevant. The simple view of reading has also been used to talk about different profiles of kids who are at risk for reading difficulties. So kids, if you look at the graph you have the graphic you have in front of you, language processes or linguistic comprehension is going up, down, and the word recognition processes are going from side to side. And individuals who have good word recognition skills or good decoding skills and also have good language skills tend to be good readers. I mean, that is the product of the simple view, right? So they have both of those skill sets, they tend to be good readers. Children who have difficulty reading words or processing phonological information about words and decoding have poor word recognition skills, but also sometimes have good language processing skills. And those are kids that we consider poor decoders or dyslexic. Importantly, I want to mention that all of these things are along a continuum, right? And so you can have a child who is a poor word reader, but doesn't have dyslexia. So there are kids who sort of fall along this line of the spectrum. And when we're thinking about teaching kids, we need to understand that. We need to target our instruction to sort of meet them where they are. There are also kids who have poor word reading and poor language comprehension skills. And so we call them just garden variety poor readers. So they would need instruction in both decoding and language comprehension. And then we have kids who, I don't love the term hyperlexia, but there are kids who can read very, very, very fluently, but they don't know what they're reading. And in a lot of cases, we attribute that to poor language comprehension processes, so poor oral language, and maybe they need some instruction in that space. And so why is this important? Because there are many, many, many children across the country who struggle with reading development. It's estimated that it's about 20 to 25% of all school-age children, and that represents about 12.5 million children across the country. And we also know that with regular instruction, children do not outgrow reading difficulties. They need extra instruction. So I'm going to dig just a little bit into this notion of phonological processing and decoding based in the science of reading. So one of the findings that has been repeatedly shown in the literature is that early readers need to be explicitly taught how to make connections between the oral pronunciation of a word and its written form. So take, for example, the word cat. If I were to ask me to tell me the sounds in the word cat, you would hopefully say cat. The ability to break apart a word into the smallest unit of sound is called phonemic awareness. Early reading instruction based in the science of reading includes an emphasis on phonological and phonemic awareness. We want young children as early as pre-K to be working with and manipulating sounds and words. We also want children exposed to the written form of sounds, so letters. And we want them to make connections between the sounds and the written letters. If a young child were to encounter the sentence, "the cat ran fast," and cat was a new word or one that the child had not yet mastered, we would want them to use their knowledge of sounds and letter to sound correspondences to sound out the word. And this skill should be explicitly taught to our youngest learners. This process is called orthographic mapping, and it requires phonemic awareness, letter sound correspondence, and knowledge of the alphabetic principle. Much of the controversy in the reading world is between what is commonly known as whole language or whole word instruction versus phonics instruction, which is what I just described as explicit teaching of the skills necessary for orthographic mapping. In whole word reading, the theory was that reading was a visual memory process by which children learn how to read by recognizing whole words when they were exposed to them repeatedly. This has been largely debunked by the scientific literature, such that we now know that early readers, to become proficient, break out words into individual sounds or phonemes, and then use their knowledge of letter sound correspondence to read written print. In a whole language 3 cueing approach, or what is sometimes called MSV in a popular curriculum, students, when they encounter an unknown word, such as the word cat, in the example, the cat ran fast, they would be instructed to use 3 different cues to read the word cat, meaning, structure, and visual cues. So they may be asked to use a strategy such as, look at the first letter and look at the picture and see what makes sense. Or try a word that you may think may make sense. Use your background knowledge to think about a word that may make sense, or skip the word and come back if you need to. So on the surface, these strategies don't appear horrible, but what children are not asked to do, nor are they explicitly taught to do in this model of instruction, is use letter sound correspondences to sound out words. And we know that this is how early word reading develops in the brain. The cueing teaching strategies are contrary to what we know of how reading develops in the brain. It's important for teachers to know that when a student becomes a skilled or automatic word reader, they automatically read whole words, but they are processing them as units of sound. So when skilled readers process every single letter and sound, but we do it so quickly and efficiently that our reading appears to be automatic. For children who struggle learning to read, understanding the difference between whole word and phonics-based approaches to early reading instruction is particularly important. It is essential that we teach the students explicitly how to use phonics or letter sound correspondences to read unknown words. This is what we commonly call unlocking the code. And so remember that reading words does not come naturally. Young children need to be explicitly taught how to do it. Importantly, this instruction must be consistent and follow an explicit scope and sequence. Research has shown that direct and explicit modeling of these skills is important. We should not expect that students can engage in self-directed phonics activities such as word sorting or sound matching, and that this is adequate phonics and orthographic mapping instruction. So we know that nationwide, the cueing approach to early reading instruction is common, despite being debunked by the scientific literature. A recent survey by Ed Week, actually I believe it came out in December of 2019, found that 65% of districts and divisions across the country have invested in early reading curriculum that follow a cueing approach. So if you see this type of instruction where students are asked to skip or guess unknown words instead of learning how to sound out words, it should be a red flag. And I implore people who are in the position of making decisions about curriculum that are used at the division and school level to look at the materials that are being used and make sure they're aligned with the science of reading. So early readers should not be taught how to read words by guessing words, skipping words, or using the picture to determine the word. So we also know, and I stated this a little bit earlier, that explicitly teaching linguistic comprehension and language is also essential for reading comprehension. So I'm going to talk briefly about this. I think one of the issues that the science of reading has right now on the public stage is that for some people, it appears to be a push for a phonics only approach. And there's just nobody saying that. Nobody is saying that the entirety of an ELA curriculum should be phonics only and word reading. We are all very aware that building listening comprehension and vocabulary skills is also really, really important and should be an essential part of curriculum from pre-K to 3rd grade and beyond. So how do we do this instruction? We do it through high quality read alouds. We do it through asking both inferential and literal questions during read alouds, explicit teaching of vocabulary and multiple exposures to words. Children need multiple experiences in different contexts with new words when it's introduced to them, building children's background knowledge, and engagement with rich text starting in pre-K. So we know that it's really, really important to build early language skills. We want kids, when they sort of transition from the 3rd to 4th and 5th grade, we want them to be able to engage in complex text. But to be able to do that, they have to be able to decode fluently, so they have to be able to read words fluently, and they also have to have knowledge of language. They have to have the vocabulary to understand what they're reading. I want to spend a little bit of time talk about why early reading instruction is so important. So why do we talk about pre-K to 3 as a crucial time for early literacy development? Well, there have been several studies to show that when we have systems in place to detect children who have reading difficulties early, we are then able to respond early, and that reading intervention in the early grades can be more powerful than in later grades. We know from several longitudinal studies of reading that reading difficulties do not fix themselves. So a child who is a poor reader at the end of 1st grade has a 90% chance of remaining a poor reader in 4th grade and a 75% chance of being a poor reader as long as they are in school. We also know from studies that it takes 4 times as long to remediate reading difficulties if we wait until 4th grade. So if we consider this from a resource standpoint, schools would be utilizing their resources more efficiently if we could accurately screen for children who have reading difficulties and provide them intervention in the early years of schooling. In fact, there are several studies to show that when children receive scientifically based reading intervention in the early years of school, the most at-risk kids can be taught to decode or read words. So one question that we have is, how do we do this? How do we adequately meet the instructional needs of early readers in an efficient and effective way? And who is responsible for providing this instruction, particularly for children who show early signs of reading difficulties? I want to spend a little time talking about core classroom instruction. Children enter classrooms with varying levels of literacy and language, and this can be a challenge for teachers to think about how to address all of their needs. One way to think about this and visualize the needs of a classroom is to think about which children need a structured literacy approach or explicit and systematic phonics, and which children are going to learn to read words and comprehend and read with ease. And so some children just sort of arrive knowing how to read. This is a widely used graphic used with permission from Nancy Young that breaks down what we know about the empirical literature about different profiles of readers and the early literacy instruction that they need. I tend to think that it's easier to visualize this as a classroom of students. So if we think about this, all of these brains on here, there's 24 of them, represent one student in a kindergarten or first grade classroom. The breakdown would look like this. So 2 of the children in the classroom are going to learn how to read no matter what type of curriculum they encounter. Or they may already know how to read upon arrival in the classroom. These are represented by the orange brains in the corner. 4 more children of these children are likely to quickly learn with any reading approach with relative ease. Okay. About 6 of these children will struggle greatly to learn how to read. A systematic phonics approach is required for this group of students, and it is likely that they will need repeated exposures or supplemental instruction on top of an evidence-based core reading instruction in their general education environment. Finally, about 50% of the class would greatly benefit from a scientifically based reading instruction. These kids are the ones that likely show relative risk on an early screening measure. So if we want them to become efficient readers, it is essential that they are receiving evidence-based approaches in the early grades of schooling, because they may not qualify for supplemental reading instruction. So we want them to be getting that instruction in their core curriculum. Importantly, none of these children in the classroom will be harmed if a teacher implements evidence-based reading instruction, so instruction that is aligned with the science of reading. So if we're thinking about providing effective and efficient reading instruction, it begins with high quality, scientifically aligned instruction in the core classroom environment. And this instruction is the responsibility of a general education teacher. This requires that we invest in the professional development of our in-service teachers. Okay, so we know that high quality is important, but we also know that dosage is important, and it's in particular for kids who are struggling. This is often conceptualized through a tiered approach. Used to be called response intervention, RTI, now more commonly called MTSS, multiple tiered systems of support. And so what you have in this system is a tier 1, which represents our core instruction. And so this is the instruction that every child is getting in the classroom. Our tier 2 and tier 3 kids are the kids who we screen, and they have difficulty with reading, so they need supplemental instruction. Virginia is lucky that this framework actually exists already, and the supplemental instruction piece of it is funded through EIRI. So, but there are some important pillars to the framework that are essential and not present in the current Virginia system. First and foremost, the framework relies on a high quality, scientifically aligned instruction in the core classroom. When this is not present, you run into the risk of over-identifying or falsely identifying students for supplemental instruction. Further, the screening system needs to be tightly aligned to science. What I mean by this is that we need to be measuring early literacy skills that we know are predictive of later reading outcomes. And finally, the supplemental instruction provided by the ERI dollars must be aligned to the evidence base. We know from the literature that children who are struggling to learn how to read require this type of instruction. And so we have the framework in Virginia, but it's dated, and it's not performing to its fullest potential. So we know that across the tiers, we want instruction to be explicit and systematic. And we know that for our kids who are really struggling, we need it to be targeted and be at a certain amount of dosage. So more dosage than the kids who just need core curriculum. So I want to briefly mention a study that I did in this area where we provided evidence-based core curriculum, and we also provided supplemental instruction. And more recently, this is a study that was funded by U.S. Department of Education. And we randomly assigned teachers to be in a treatment or control group in 120 classrooms in Texas and California. And these were first grade teachers. And we provided intensive professional development and coaching for these teachers around the science of reading, and also both core and supplemental instruction. And we were particularly interested in the kids who were the 20th, who were performing the worst in the class in reading. So the 20% of kids who were performing the worst in reading in these first grade classrooms. We targeted both decoding and listening comprehension, so both sides of the simple view. And what we found, and when you look at dosage, so we found that kids need that core curriculum, right? So they really need that evidence-based curriculum. But we also found significant differences depending on how much dosage they got in the supplemental evidence-based instruction. So what you see on the top is our word reading results. And so the blue line are children who were not in the treatment groups. They did not get the supplemental evidence-based instruction. And then it goes up, children who got 20 sessions, 40 sessions, and 60 sessions. And what you can see is that as kids got more dosage of the evidence-based instruction, they got better at both word reading and listening comprehension. And this is kind of like finding, right? It's like, okay, yes, of course they got better as they got more dosage, but it also sort of speaks to the level of intensity of instruction that kids need who are struggling to learn how to read in the early grades. Okay, so you may be saying to me, so what's going on here? If we know so much about reading, why isn't it reaching our classrooms? And I think this is a huge question that requires much more than a 45-minute presentation. But there is a large evidence base, and we are failing at translating that research into what happens for kids every single day in classroom instruction. And that falls largely on the shoulders of people who are in my position. So we have been historically bad at translating our science out to the masses. And also, I would say we've been historically bad at really listening to the community about what is working for them and what is not working for them. You know, we can design beautiful interventions, but if you get it, you have to do that in collaboration with teachers, with practicing teachers, because if you design a beautiful intervention and you get it into a school setting and it's just not feasible, then it doesn't work for anybody and it's not going to improve reading instruction. So I think this conversation between higher ed and schools needs to be continuous, needs to be collaborative, needs to be two ways. It's not just a one-way street. And then also briefly, you know, I am the one, I always say publicly that there's no silver bullet here, right? Teaching every single child or training every single teacher how to teach phonics in an evidence-based way, that's a movement toward improvement, but it's not the silver bullet, right? Because there's so many other things happening. And our teachers really operate in a very complex system. And one important piece here is, of course, higher ed. I mean, there's been a lot of talk recently about how we are preparing our teachers to teach reading. And I think we really rely on our institutes of higher education to be up to date with the literature base. But there's some real evidence to suggest that we are not doing our job to prepare teachers that are teaching reading based in the science. And you know, there are movements across Virginia to work toward this. We've done a lot of work at UVA. We took a critical lens to what we were doing at UVA, and we've changed our programming. And then there are folks across Virginia in different institutes of higher ed that we're meeting with on a somewhat regular basis now to talk about how we can make these changes at the higher education level. And there's also, there's all these different levers that we have to push on simultaneously if we really want to see change in reading outcomes for kids. So takeaway thoughts. So reading comprehension requires both adequate word reading and oral language, and word reading should be taught in a way that is based in the science and how our brain learns how to read words. There's a solid evidence base to inform how we should teach early word reading. And also this evidence base informs how we should screen for early reading difficulties. Early screening and instruction is essential. We know that because longitudinal studies show us that the biggest bang for our buck comes when we do the screening and instruction early. And we know that we have existing frameworks in Virginia that should be utilized to implement high quality early reading instruction. So I'm going to stop there, and I am happy to answer questions for a few moments.
Well, thank you, Dr. Solari, for that really rich and grounding presentation in the neuroscience of all of this. We have just a few questions that have come through. So the first one, could you please address running records and if time should be spent doing these?
I missed the second part, sorry, Holly.
No, that's okay. Could you please address running records and if time should be spent doing these?
Right, so that's a good question. I think this is a commonly used assessment tool by our teachers. I would say that there's not a very strong evidence base for their use for informing how we should be teaching reading in a scientifically based way. And so if there are other tools to use that where you can do quick checks of early literacy skills that we know are predictive of later reading comprehension. So if you can make a decision on this, you're better off using those other tools.
Great, thank you for that advice. We've got a question about the slides and whether or not we'll make those available. And yes, we can pull all that together for folks. Let's see. When you're looking at the pre-kindergarten instruction, how do we developmentally support children with language development and the beginning process of phonemic awareness?
Right. So that's a really good question, and it's more than I can answer in 30 seconds. We could do a separate presentation on that. But I think it's really important to note, and I didn't say it out loud, but when we do this instruction around phonemic awareness, you really want to do it in a playful way, especially pre-K, first and second grades. This is not where you're sort of this rote sort of memorization. We are asking kids to engage in playing with words, basically playing with the sounds of words and doing different activities where they are sounding out a particular word or rhyming particular words, sounding out words, and then removing one sound and adding another one. And this instruction can be very developmentally appropriate. It can be very engaging for students. And we're not saying you do this for 2 hours a day. That is not developmentally appropriate. We're saying that you do this for 10 minutes in the morning and maybe 10 minutes in the afternoon, and we're allowing children time to play with language.
Great, thank you for that. There was a question about your reference to Virginia frameworks. Can you provide a list of what you're referring to?
So I can just say it out loud. I'm referring to both the ERRI framework and also our screening framework. I mean, Anita's going to go into screening much more deeply than I did, but this is actually pretty unique. I mean, we are in a very lucky position and a fortunate position. I've never worked in a state where these frameworks were already part of the system. And so I think that if you've only been in Virginia for a long time, you may not know that, or you may lose sight of that. We have solid frameworks from which to build to make sure that all kids are getting access to evidence-based instruction.
Great. We have a question about what would be your suggestion for supporting language learners who also need phonics support? Should this instruction come at the Tier 1 level or with specialists?
Right. So I think, are we talking about English learners, English language learners? Okay, yeah, so this is actually one of my areas of research. So it has to come at both. I mean, what we know from the simple view of reading for English language learners is that, I've done some of this work and some of my other colleagues have done this work, is that both decoding and language comprehension are predictive of later reading comprehension for English language learners. But they may develop it, like their relative importance may be different at different times than from when you compare it to monolingual learners. So that language load is really, really important for English language learners. So developing those skills has to come in the core program and also through supplemental instruction if that's necessary.
All right. I think we've got time maybe for one more. Where are we in the process of bridging the university to classroom gap for veteran teachers in the field teaching the structured literacy approach?
Yeah, for in-service teachers, is that the question? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a super important question because we have generations of teachers who may not have received what we wanted them to receive and how to teach reading. And I think that there are important collaborative relationships that could be established between institutions of higher education and the Department of Education to make sure that these in-service teachers are getting training. Also, I know there's already efforts going on at the VDOE so that some teachers across the Commonwealth have received, for example, letters training, which really builds teacher knowledge around the science-based science of reading. So, but I think there's ways in which we can collaborate. And I would say just really briefly, it was interesting to me, we've now had 2 of these calls organized by Chev, which I'm helping to organize in collaboration actually with Decoding Dyslexia. And on our last call, there was a lot of talk up from the faculty that they want to engage more around this stuff with the VDOE. And I think sometimes we hesitate to reach out to each other, but I think that there is a space. I think that this is the time when we do want to be collaborating in these ways.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, it's something we can all work on together for certain. So I apologize to folks. We're not going to be able to get to all of the questions in the Q&A, but we'll take record of those. And if there's anything we can pull in the resources we provide on the early literacy webpage by way of follow-up, we'll be sure to do that. So Dr. Solari, I'm going to hand it back over to you, and I think you get to introduce our next speaker.
I do, yeah. So it's my great privilege and honor to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Anita McGinty. She is a research associate professor at the UVA School of Education and Human Development. She holds a doctoral degree in educational psychology, applied developmental science, and a master's in speech and language pathology. She is the primary investigator of PALS and a co-investigator on the Virginia Preschool Development Grant, Birth to 5. She works with educators serving children birth to grade 3, and her primary interest is in young children's language and literacy development for the prevention of later reading difficulties. So I will now turn this over to Dr. McGinty.
Thank you, Emily, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for having me to be part of this robust day around literacy and reading and the science of reading. I am honored to be here. I'm honored that you're spending your precious hours with us on this topic, and very grateful to the many hours of work that went into organizing all of us. I'm so grateful to be here. So let's see, here we go. One of the things that struck me as I was listening to Dean Pianta and to Dr. Solari was the way that we have, I think, convergence without having planned it. You are going to hear, I think, very similar themes, but I'm applying my focus of the science to a particular strand that you heard Emily speak to as part of the broader system, which is how data flows to support early prevention and intervention. And so I think, you know, it's great to hear these same themes in different directions, because it really does point to the fact that many of our messages sit on a scientific base where they come together. So what I'm going to do is focus on first reflecting on that framework that Emily referred to, and going a little bit deeper into the system and infrastructure that is in place in Virginia in support of screening and prevention. And then taking a lens to the themes from the science of reading to what that means for screening, and considering what that means for points of strengthening and building as we go forward. So as Emily mentioned, Virginia has a long history of a commitment to screening and prevention. It has had in place a robust piece of legislation, the EIRI legislation, since 1997. And it is very unique, and it's unique in a couple of different ways. One of the important ones is that it has created a coherent system over 20 years of data on young children, and it's the same data across schools and divisions across the state. It's used in a standardized manner, and it's used in a similar time frame. So this creates trend information. It creates information that's actionable and informative down to the classroom level, but it also creates information that allows us to reflect on our practice as within regions, within divisions across the state. The other thing that's unique because of the longevity of the infrastructure in Virginia is the connectivity it gives to the base of educators. Everything occurs within the screening system through an online portal, but that online portal is not just about accessing a test. It's about robust sets of professional outreach and communication tools. It's a mechanism for, again, standardizing the approach to screening across the state, and it's a mechanism for folding in new ideas. For example, the same portal is the place from which the VKRP arm in kindergarten connects. And so it's a network of connectivity of people and ideas. Over 18,000 educators, preschool to third grade, are connected within this portal. And this is huge. When we think about screening, I think we often go right to a measure, but it is a huge leverage point to do well and do better by having such an infrastructure. And when you look nationally, it is unique. So Dr. Solari showed you this same map, but focused on the breadth of dyslexia legislation across the country. I'm honing in on the specific legislation around screening within that broader framework. And what you see is essentially these states in blue are the ones that have some degree of universal screening mandated within their legislation. But when you go into each of the pieces of legislation, which I did briefly across the different states, you see that less than 1/3 really have the consistency and coherence that Virginia has in its approach. When you go further, you find within the states that have both screening and intervention within their legislation, that number drops. And then beyond that, you see that even as the states are growing in robustness across screening and intervention, in many places it's new. So it's a new idea. Some of these pieces of legislation have started in 2010. I would say over half, though, have really started since 2016. So it's a new behavior to change, and it's a new level of commitment that these states have to establish. And in Virginia, we have that commitment of the educators. And I think this has been something I've reflected on over the past 6 months in particular, when I think about the commitment that has occurred when we are talking about state screening in the middle of a pandemic, in a fall where there's various models and capacity around educating our young students. And yet we see this fall, this is as of last week already, 130,000 assessments have been conducted, K-3. We still have a month left in the window this year. We see that questions and new resources that are designed to help with the particular challenges of this fall are being robustly accessed and used. So, and this is a commitment of individuals, of teachers, of school leaders, of division leaders. And we are seeing unprecedented levels of questions come our way. We are getting about 500 sort of contacts a week. It has been in the past about 400 a month. And this is a workforce that wants to do right by the children. And I think we're seeing this kind of activity because in Virginia, because of the history and the infrastructure, there is an understanding that doing screening well and right leads to visibility of children and leads to an ability to serve them. So as Emily mentioned, and I will talk about later, while there's room for improvement, there is a base of understanding the why of screening, which is really critical. So I want to draw your attention to why it's so critical. It's always been critical, but it's really critical at this juncture. What we're looking at here is data from 2019. So kindergarten children coming in fall of 2019, 1 year ago. Along the bottom, you have the range of scores for a PALS screener in kindergarten, and along the top, along the vertical, you have the counts of children who are getting different scores. The line demarcates children who are below the PALS benchmark or the threshold for the screener. Children under that threshold, under EIRI, are eligible for 2.5 hours of extra instruction above the classroom, and they get state incentive funding to support that effort. What you see here is about 17% of incoming kindergartners fall below that threshold. If you looked over trend lines, it's a slight uptick from the past about 5 years ago. We've seen slow upticks in this number. But if you look across the last 10, actually the last 15 years, it lands somewhere in the 14 to 17% range over that time period. We took data from a national study from the NWEA suggesting that, on a very ballpark average, children across grades and ages could be coming in with approximately 70% of the skills that you might expect in a typical beginning of school year, given some of the learning loss that Emily talked through earlier. These are projections. These are hypothetical projections. We have not fully been able to look at all the data yet that is actually coming in the door. But the situation is that because of potential learning loss that we're going to see, we could see numbers of children below the threshold of PALS, below the screening threshold, that is unprecedented in the history of the length of screening in this state. these children who are sort of blue but below the line would be children you might not have expected to be below threshold had they had a typical year, but now may fall vulnerable. And that equates to about, in kindergarten, potentially up to 7,000 more children. And if you look at this same thing in first grade, on the left, you have the 2019, and on the right, you have the potential with learning loss, and you have potentially up to 11,000 more children who might fall below the benchmark. And so these data speak to the importance of taking our systems and putting our best foot forward, as we always wanted to, but it is an essential and critical moment to take a hard look at everything that's working and ensure it's working as effectively as possible. And doing so is not just, for a matter of improving our systems. It is really a call to action because it's an issue of equity if we don't. When we go back to the 2019 data, the 13,000 or almost 14,000 children who fell below the threshold, there's a disproportionate number who are English language learners, who are economically disadvantaged, and who are Black or Hispanic in that category of children below the threshold. And we know the disparities and the inequities that are systemic and have been brought to light are very likely to enhance the inequitable profile of scores and skills in early reading. And so the best way to move forward is to move forward with a lens of building upon the strong infrastructure and the potential that is there, and to move into a strengthening and improving mindset by starting with the science, as we've been talking about today. So I think, as Dean Pianta and Emily talked about, the science of reading can sometimes be thought of in a narrow way, but is actually a robust interdisciplinary base of information that points to critical and convergent themes. So the science of reading is not just a few studies on how to instruct. It is a series of bodies of work that span developmental psychology, that span cognitive psychology, that span education, general education, reading education, speech language pathology. It's a body of work that spans neuroscience, and I'm sure I'm leaving some out, but it is a interdisciplinary, robust, and long set of knowledge that can point to very specific actions. And so Emily gave us a great overview of many aspects of this whole body of knowledge, and particularly how it informs instructional practices. I want to pull on the idea of how this interdisciplinary set of information can talk to us about screening and really about the idea of risk. So when I think about the science related to screening, I also think in a broad and interdisciplinary way. And I think about the fact that the key themes that point us in the right direction from the science is that it needs to be linked to an underlying model of development that is supported in science. It needs to incorporate what we know about measurement, and it needs to think about the concepts of prevention and intervention and its role within the broader system. Really, the science of screening blends knowledge of development and knowledge of measurement for a preventative system. So it takes those concepts and seeks to build an infrastructure that works. And so I want to look to some of this science to guide our conversation as we reflect on the processes within Virginia that are at play. So understanding risk, when you think about early reading development, it comes down to what is your underlying theory. So as Emily mentioned, there's been a long history in reading. And if you go back, some of the earlier ideas were that potentially reading difficulties was the result of a lag in broad neuropsychological development. In that case, the screening approaches focused on broad developmental differences in both perceptual and cognitive abilities. And when that was the focus, they found certain indicators that would predict. What started to happen is the idea that those are not core. And what started to evolve was the importance of language, oral and written language development, as the underlying developmental concept that was evolving for successful reading. And when that was understood and those models were developed, the predictors began to become specific and both and powerful and instructionally transparent. And so the basis that we work from today within screening is the idea that reading is grounded in oral and written language development. And this model is one maybe you remember from Emily's slides. I'm going to spend just a moment on it too, but it is a really important concept. It is a different version or view of the simple view of reading that we also have both referenced. They point to very similar ideas. The top part of this rope is oral language development. The things that are listed here, the skills that are listed here, are things that evolve in oral language as well as within skilled written language. The skills at the bottom are specific to written language development. They're about the translation, and together they braid into skilled reading or reading success. What I really like in this model that is visual is the idea that both these strands begin early, that both these strands are important to successful reading. And also, implied in the ropes is that these two strands have different developmental pathways. And I think all of those things are important when you think about how to take knowledge of development into a screening tool. So I want to spend just a moment on this. So when you think about oral and written language development, they are rooted together, though they're different. So you think about a young, even infant or a baby or toddler, to them, they are hardwired to communicate. So they are attuned to speech and conversation. They are aware that there are other communicative tools in their environment, such as books or even writing utensils that they see adults using to communicate, and they seek to mimic that and engage with that. And they become aware very early of symbols around them, of the literate world, and they are aware that they're meaningful, particularly when those symbols are linked to something enjoyable or interesting to them. And that is the most fundamental approach that they take to language development. It spans oral and written language development. However, they do not have any idea exactly how written language works. And that's because they're not the same process. And we've heard that spoken about earlier today, but I think it's a really important one to spend just a moment on, because it justifies, again, the importance of spending time on screening and on prevention when it comes to written language development and reading. So language is a communicative system. It's a symbolic system, same as written language, but it's different. So you start with the symbol, which is a word in a stream of speech, and that word connects to something real, a cat, or maybe it connects to an action, or it connects to a feeling, which is a little more ephemeral, but still important and real. And then you think about written language. You have a symbol, which is a letter, and it connects to a sound, which is really abstract. And actually, when you go into the speech science that we've been referencing, you find out that it's not even really a true thing. So the sound k or a or t exists within this speech stream. And if you look to the very left of my circle, you see just a little burst of something and then a lot of white, which means a lot of nothing. That's your C, that's your k. And then in the middle is your vowel. And then to the right is another sort of large bit of nothing, which is your t. So the actual sounds in human speech exist on the margins of the vowels, and they exist with a little bit of signal that you get within different parts of the sounds. They are not true solid things. They are things that your brain gets trained to categorize and put together within speech, so you can start to make the translation to the code. That's really important because it's what Emily discussed, which is that it's not natural. It's not a natural process, and because it's not a natural process, we have to be much more aware of how it's evolving. And so when we think about screening, we have to think about how it evolves across a broad developmental spectrum of oral and written language. And we have to think about how we can start to signal those things across time. And I think one of the things that we'll turn to now is the idea of when can you reliably start to understand how written language is evolving in a way that's meaningful to reading success. And it usually happens somewhere around preschool to kindergarten is when you start to be able to measure written language development. But part of the importance of what we just talked about the broad roots of oral and written language, is that by the time you're screening, a lot has already happened. And this is really important to remember. A lot has happened and a lot of experiences have happened, and those still roll up. So even as you're beginning screening, development has occurred prior to that point that is meaningful. And that gets us to then, how do we take that knowledge and that broad knowledge of development, knowing we can't measure and don't want to measure from day one as babies, but we come into it around preschool. We understand a lot has happened before even that point, and then even more happens in the preschool 3 and 4-year-old years as they enter kindergarten. How do we use that knowledge and development to create a system where we can understand risk? And really, what we're trying to do is find a signal in noise, right? We are trying to find elements that tell us something meaningful about the developmental process that we can count on to guide action. And so a signal in noise is a way to think about it. Our challenge is our signal keeps changing, as children tend to do, especially in the early years. And so understanding how to take development and the concept that finding signals that matter across time while the children are evolving is the task in front of us. We have to recognize that screening by itself is going to be an imperfect system. And that is a lot of what the science will tell you is how to balance and that imperfection for the most positive outcomes for children. So in the perfect world, the signal is stable and we're 100% correct. We have children who need help, and we have children who do not need help. But in reality, that's not quite what we get. So depending on how hard we make the threshold within a screener, we will have either a really wide net, and we'll have children who are flagged as potentially at risk, but maybe are not, maybe do not need the resources that would come with an intensive intervention that might come as the result of screening. Potentially more concerning, however, is if we make the threshold too low, we are going to miss some children who actually would have needed intervention. And if we are in a system where they don't have screening occurring very often, potentially we're missing critical windows of intervention. And that is, of course, the more concerning problem when you're thinking about reading prevention. So I want to look at this idea within Virginia data. So here you have a relationship between the kindergarten score, which goes around the bottom, and the percentage of children who by the end of first grade are going to show risk. And the red line is children below the benchmark, that's the score. So what you have here are the children who are coming in kindergarten entry below the benchmark. About 40 to 80% of them will continue to be at risk in first grade. They're an elevated, very vulnerable group of children. Of course, that percentage depends on intervention and the effectiveness of intervention, as well as the severity of challenges the children may be experiencing in reading and a host of other developmental areas. So it's a wide range, but this is a highly elevated risk. And part of that is the nature of the PALS benchmark. So children who are coming into kindergarten and fall below the benchmark are not just not reading. They know less than 12 letters. They often know less than 5-letter sounds. They hardly can rhyme, if at all, and they have trouble even connecting 2 words as being similar because they share a first sound. So this is a significant delay in their aspects of literacy development. However, they are not the only vulnerable children. So if you think about a child who is just to the left of that red line, who is below the benchmark, and then you think of a child just to the right of that red line, so is not identified in the screener as below the benchmark, those children are not very different. And only progressively, as you get sort of further away from the red line on both sides, do the differences become that distinct. The group of children that I've highlighted here come into kindergarten and they are not identified as being below the screener's threshold. And yet 20 to 40% of those children will be identified by spring of first grade. These are vulnerable children. These are not dissimilar to the group of children that Emily highlighted, where the discussion was, even if they're not qualifying for intensive intervention, there's vulnerabilities that need to be addressed through the instructional environment. And this is a lot of children. So this is about, again, 2019 data, 14,000 children were identified approximately below the threshold in kindergarten, but 33,000 children would fall into that yellow range that I just discussed. And so this is a lot of room for children to be left behind by an instructional environment that doesn't address their broader needs, or to fall, go the wrong direction from yellow down to red instead of progressing in their reading development. So how do we handle this? We have screeners that are not perfect, and we have risk and vulnerability that exists on a continuum. And what the science points to, and what Emily also pointed to, is the fact that screening has to be embedded in a broader system of information and prevention. And so this schematic outlines where screening fits in. Screening is one tool, and it exists as one piece of information. Often screening can occur multiple times a year, then it becomes sort of a screening as well as interim assessment. That's embedded within broader progress monitoring and response to instruction, as well as, if needed, it flags, screening can flag the need for more diagnostic testing. So understanding screening as a piece of information that takes you down a pathway, also understanding it's an iterative and repeatable piece of your entire landscape of prevention, which also includes instruction and considering response to instruction, helps mitigate some of the challenges that we can see in the science around screening, which points to the fact that it's an imperfect tool. So this part of the science goes from development to the idea of how you measure risk within the concept of development. And two of the big ideas is that risk exists on a continuum, and understanding the risk unfolds over time, as well as within a broader landscape of information and action. So those are the two kind of areas of the science that I think speak strongly to the directions for assessment or screening and prevention within Virginia. And so I want to take a look at that a little closer. The developmental science, as well as the concept of how you really use screening to accurately detect risk, both point to the importance of continuity over time, screening over time. And in Virginia, there is a framework and infrastructure for screening over time. The ERI legislation requires, the ERI legislation does not require pre-K, but that's part of the broader state system. So within the state preschool, there's assessment of PALS pre-K in the fall and spring. And then under EIRI begins kindergarten, fall and spring, first grade spring, second grade spring, although there's a group of children who are allowed to test out under the PALS measure, and third grade spring. Similarly, there's ways of opting out certain children at that time point. These are the mandatory windows. In Virginia, there is, or those using PALS in Virginia have the option of screening up to 3 times a year across K through 3 or pre-K through 3. But they're not mandatory. And while many of the schools and divisions do use those multiple time points, it's not part of the formal structure or framework of the EIRI. One of the challenges then is that the actual structure or infrastructure of screening is more of a snapshot than continuous approach. If you really follow just the approach taken by the mandated time points, you do not have a continuous approach. You have sort of snapshots at each time. That's also what occurs within the design of the PALS measure, which focuses on criterion referenced skills at discrete points in time within development. You also don't have a robust infrastructure across the early childhood and the K-3 from a data lens. So from a data lens, the children who get early childhood, pre-K literacy assessments and have that data flow forward into their school system is really only those in the state programs. And the design of PALS, because there's a separate measure in kindergarten as separate from pre-K, it's not easy to look at growth. And similarly, because there's a separate measure of PALS and K to the 1st through 3rd grade measure, it's not easy to see growth. And in fact, because it's criterion reference snapshot approach, you cannot reliably look at growth trajectories across these years. So while we have a behavior that looks at continuous and screening over time, you do not have data that flows in a continuous way, nor looks at exactly the same skills across time. So that is an area to consider when we think about how to make the most effective system. We have a lot there, but we don't have the continuity that is pointed to from both the developmental science as well as the science of screening in general. And so this is an example of what might be a continuous approach. This is less about screening and more about development. So if you think about from the landscape of development across a 3- and 4-year-old, through the kindergarten year, through the 1st through 3rd grade year, you see different skills across print, phonological awareness, and oral language that grow and change across these time points, but could become leveraged to better understand a more continuous approach to children's growth and to risk in that development. So a good example, one I think that's just easy for me to think through, is if you think about a 3- and 4-year-old who has some knowledge of books, has some knowledge of how print works, are able to write their name because they're getting to understand that sort of very specific letters put together makes words, and they know some letters. They are able to, clap and play games with syllables and also rhyme. They evolve into a kindergarten where they know a lot of letters and they know them fairly well or fluently. They also know some letter sounds. And they're applying that into very basic word forms. And they're starting to do that. And as that evolves, you see that specific letter names and letter sounds are no longer valuable information, but they get embedded into a much broader set of skills, being able to rapidly name those letters and know them very well, being able to apply them within reading tasks. And so that's the concept of continuity. While the specific thresholds and expectations evolve, the concept is continuous across time. And then what you see here are, I've circled areas that in the current screener is not part of the broader landscape. So the extent to which you look at all these skills across time within a screening environment is something that, that also we can look to the developmental science to consider. So when we take a really pragmatic lens to the idea of screening and what the science says, there's two things. One is a screener should be a brief set of assessments of key skills that is predictive of later performance and that can identify, again, within the margins of what we understand as imperfection, but can identify children who are in need of extra support. But when you think about how screening data are collected, they're collected by teachers. They're collected by teachers using their time from the classroom to work with children to collect these data. And that means the data also have to be actionable. The predictors have to be things that are relevant to creating an instructional approach and instructional decision making, and they have to point to the kinds of things that we can instruct and intervene around. And so when you think about what across the developmental continuum you would measure within a screening environment, it's important to recognize that you can never do all the things that you would want to do. You're not doing a comprehensive diagnostic. This is a version of the same idea of the simple view of reading. You have on the left in the yellow the kinds of sub-skills that relate to decoding. You have on the right in the blue the kinds of key skills that are measurable in relation to oral language development or linguistic comprehension that also lead and predict reading. And you have them coming together in ways of fluent reading, which also can be measured. So this takes the simple view reading and puts a focus on some of the key indicators that you might measure. So in a screener, let's look at what we do currently. So in kindergarten, there are proxies for aspects of these underlying skills in phonological awareness, alphabet knowledge. We have added just this year some additional aspects that were not always available in kindergarten, but are relevant to a broad understanding of phonological awareness. They were not designed for kindergarten, but they are being repurposed to offer additional information in this very important area. As you get into the first through third grade, it instead moves to a focus on understanding aspects of word reading, aspects of spelling, and you have a graded level approach to understanding reading connected text, which is not the same thing, which is why I have distance there. It's not the same thing as fluency, but it's attempting to be a proxy for that kind of skill when you put it together. And so you have pieces of the broader model here of what relates to reading success or reading comprehension. But what you don't have is a really, as we said, cohesive over time approach to measuring this framework. And so one of the areas when we think about strengthening and improving and going forward is how to continue to look at the science to understand that that we can measure, and we can measure effectively, and we can measure efficiently, and use what we are learning to get that data that is also highly transparent to the kind of instructional behaviors that Emily talked about within evidence-based reading instruction. And so in an ideal world, you have measurement that is very direct to phonological awareness, the very key skills in alphabet knowledge in preschool, as well as aspects of the oral language. And then you have that continue and evolve in kindergarten, and then you begin to add aspects of decoding and encoding, which is putting not just words, but putting regular pattern words to use so they can apply their phonological awareness and alphabet knowledge. You continue to focus on aspects of language. In first grade, it enhances and you add aspects of text and oral reading fluency to that. And in second grade, it continues. And so what you see here is how that coherence evolves over time in an ideal picture. And while many of the same things that were pointed to through the current PALS measure are the things highlighted here, there's a difference in the way it evolves over time and in the precision with which you might measure. And so getting to the ideal is going to be an iterative and a progressive approach, I would imagine. What I want to share here is that some work has already begun on this, and I want to share it because I have gotten questions now about this concept of, PALS or PALS 2.0. And so I wanted to clarify and explain some of what has been going on. So for the past 18 months, really, maybe a little bit before that, but when Emily and I started collaborating probably more than 18 months, probably 2 years at least. Time is a little warped in our current situation, but began thinking conceptually, how would we do what I just talked about? How would we take a rigorous eye to the tasks that exist, building from the infrastructure that exists, and think about what screening could look like? And the place we started was on that left side, the yellow side of the model. So the things we started talking about are not the full picture, not the full ideal. We didn't talk about preschool at this moment, though we are starting to take our mind that way. But we started with the decoding aspect and thinking about how we can screen and use the latest science for thinking about how we would go about that. And at the same time, there was a focus on how to do so and how to meet specific children's needs within some aspects of the legislation that was coming up around dyslexia. And then there was also work groups that were having conversations. So the convergence has led to the concept of what would be improved. And the big thing that I want to notice on the left, you see, is the current PALS tasks and the different ways that they have proxies for the different parts of reading that you saw that I showed on the earlier graphic. And to the right, what you see is an alignment across time. So you have a streamlining of skills into conceptual areas that span the full continuum of development of the early years of sort of preschool through third grade and within the decoding realm. And so it focuses on, print or alphabet within the pre-K and K environment, but then phonological awareness across these, the concept of encoding and decoding. So applying these skills across the grades, and then oral reading fluency starting in first grade. Again, focused precisely on those indicators that measure that fluency. And so, although I get about probably every month or month and a half an email asking for a version of a PALS 2.0, I do want to share that we are in the conceptual and infancy stage of this development, and at the same time, work has happened. There are 1,500 items that Emily and I have worked with our teams to create. They exist in a spreadsheet. They span about 7 different kinds of tasks that we would propose would be the basis of the decoding side of such a screener, and they span these key developmental areas. And so this is where we are, and the expectation is that we continue to think about how to move this thinking and this work forward. And just to kind of reiterate, when you think about it, the things I just talked about are really on this yellow side. And we have not yet turned to the other side, which is the language and even thinking about the full continuum across the younger years to the older, but that is the map if we were to think about a really comprehensive approach to strengthening screening. And so for me, I think this is it's always about infrastructure building, which is always iterative, and it's about applying what we know into a system. So we have, as Emily said, a ready system, and we have a ready focus. I can see from the educators I engage with on a daily basis, and we can see in the conversations that are occurring across the state and divisions. And so from that, I think the best place to leave it or to think about where we go next is really with the sets of questions that guide the reflection and the critical reflection that I think Dean Pianta and Emily and myself are pointing to for today. And so I think about, do we have the right information? And does that information prompt action? Are we combining information we have into tiers of different instructional and intervention approaches and how they're working together? And how does our information prompt that? And there are efficiencies, improvements that we can apply to both the screening and the prevention for effectiveness. And I hope that has given you some good reflections on how science and sort of screening within a Virginia context specifically can be applied going forward.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. McGinty, for that presentation. We are just about at time, but we got a couple of questions as you were presenting about the projected increase in the number of students identified and how the remote administration of PALS plays into this, and whether, how that plays out. So as we wrap up, I'll see if there are any other questions here that we might answer quickly, but perhaps you could opine on that and how you all are thinking about that at this point in time.
Yeah, that's such a good question. And so the projections really, they were theoretical, so they didn't account for the different modes. However, we are closely monitoring on sort of a weekly basis the difference in remote versus in-person testing. The remote testing, and everyone who's I've had a chance to engage with or who've looked at some of what we've put out there in terms of training, it's not a validated approach at this moment in time. We have a ready team that we hope to actually be able to produce a report on the validity or the stability of testing across these two modes. But PALS wasn't designed from a remote testing standpoint, so we need to look at that. At the same time, very preliminary, sort of eyeballs to the data, we're finding very similar distributions and levels across the in-person and remote testing, which I can imagine could be surprising to some. I know the experience of testing can often feel very different when things change, but we are finding sort of patterns in the data are decently similar, but that needs a lot more close eyes, which we are on and positioned to do. I think that is another time and place where sort of relative performance and a continuum of risk becomes a really important way to use and interpret the data.
Great. Well, thanks for that. I know we're all curious to see how that data continues to play out over the rest of the year. There was a question about the Virginia law that requires PALS. My understanding is that's just budget language, actually, and the funding for it there. There were a couple of questions and at the end about going to your last slide, as well as the slide with your questions. So I don't know if you or Kelly can go back to those, and you can, yep, there we go, throw those up on the screen for folks to take a note of those while we wrap up here. So we are at a breaking point this morning. We are going to take about a 7-minute stretch break here. You can refill your coffee, stretch your legs, and come back here at 10:55, at which point we are going to turn the floor over to some colleagues from Martinsville and some colleagues from Missouri who are going to share with us their experience on the ground, translating all of this wonderful science and practice into the realities of their students and for their staff. So come back here at 10:55 and we'll jump in with that panel, and we'll see you all in a few minutes. Thanks, guys. All righty, everyone. Well, it is 10:55, so we are going to hop into our last segment here with the panel. It is my pleasure this morning to introduce you to a colleague of mine, Jenna Conway, who is the Chief School Readiness Officer for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And prior to her appointment here in Virginia, Jenna served as the Assistant Superintendent of Early Childhood at the Louisiana Department of Education. And while she was in Louisiana, she led a first-of-its-kind effort to unify and improve the state's childcare, Head Start, and pre-K system. She has held a variety of other positions in public housing and program management. She is actually a native of Charlottesville and has a degree in American Studies from Yale and an MBA from Stanford. And it is my great pleasure this morning to turn it over to Jenna to lead the conversation with our esteemed colleagues from Martinsville and Missouri. Jenna, it's all yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Very excited to be here. As Holly noted, I typically focus on birth to 5, strengthening state systems in order to give every child the opportunity to enter school ready. Not typically an expert on reading, but as Anita showed us, kids who come in least prepared are also least likely to be able to read proficiently by 3rd grade. And that has a set of implications for not only literacy, but math, social studies, science, and even how much kids like and care about school, which means that this is not just a conversation about early literacy that starts at kindergarten, but has to go further back, that we as the adults in the system must build birth to 3rd grade systems that put every kid on track for success. And I noted that that question came up from Melissa in the last session, right? That even starting at pre-K in some ways is starting too late. Before I introduce our esteemed panelists, I want to revisit our objective 4 this morning. Our goal in this session is to help connect the content you've just heard from Emily and Anita to real life initiatives and practices to help strengthen early literacy in your schools, in your community. So we're going to get real here. And there's nothing better than hearing from practitioners, people from across our country and across our Commonwealth who've actually done this work. They'll share what they've learned, what was successful, and there's some pretty exciting success stories here, and also what to watch out for. Let's start to introduce our panelists. In a moment, I'll just ask our panelists to introduce themselves, their name, their title, and where they're from. But first, I wanted to give you a little bit more information about what these incredible adults have done for the kids in their system. We have educators from 2 areas, one from the New Madrid County R1 School District in Missouri, and the other set of leaders from Martinsville City Schools. In New Madrid, very exciting to read that as of last year, English and language arts scores are increasing at a higher rate in this particular division than anybody else in the Southeast region of their state. So doing tremendous work to kind of dramatically grow 3rd grade ELA results. They've doubled the rate of 3rd graders who are proficient or advanced in just a few years. And that's paid out for math too. So more than doubling the number of their 3rd graders who are able to score proficient or advanced on 3rd grade tests. So both huge outcomes in terms of literacy and math, really stemming from sort of science-based approach. Meanwhile, in Martinsville, they've led under Superintendent Talley a tremendous shift in mindset. And in really important words as we think about kind of how we ensure that all kids can read, but they believe that success is possible no matter the circumstances that kids face. And I think that is so important in terms of what's going on in the world with COVID and the pandemic, and also as we take more of a focus on equity, right? And really ensuring that all kids, regardless of background, regardless of zip code, skin color, language spoken at home, have the opportunity to be successful, right? And we know to be a successful adult in our world, you have to be literate, right? You have to have those key skills. All of the schools, they've helped ensure that they're all accredited and have just done tremendous work working really with their community, with public and private partners to put their kids on track for success. So really exciting results in both of these areas, and I can't wait to learn more about what they've done. What I'll ask now is, starting with Dr. Duncan, if you could just introduce yourself so folks can connect the name to the screen, your title, and whether you're from Missouri or from Martinsville.
Thank you so much, Jenna. I'm listening to myself on Ms. Hanlon's computer across the room. So I am Sam Duncan. I'm the superintendent of New Madrid. You know, we put the accent on the mad. There are reasons for that, I'm sure. New Madrid County R1 School District. I've been the superintendent since 2016 when Ms. Hanlon and I joined forces, and we are completely sold out to the work that you're describing here, and the numbers do reflect that. One thing I did want to mention is, as we're introducing this, Ms. Hanlon's building, Matthews Elementary, which under her guidance has seen remarkable results, also has been the fastest growing on literacy and numeracy in the state of Missouri for the past 2 years. So it's #1 in the state in terms of growth. And then the only other thing that I did want to say was that, you know, I know that earlier, you know, we're talking about this being an iterative process, which is a fun word. It's also highly replicable, and I'll leave you with that.
Excellent. Well, with that introduction, Ms. Hanlon, do you want to introduce yourself?
What'd she say? Hi, can you hear me? Hi, I'm Angie Hanlon. I'm the building principal at Matthews Elementary here in the New Madrid County R1 School District. I'm in my 6th year as principal, and I'm just honored and excited to be on here and talk about some of the things that we've learned and some of the practices that we've been able to put into place based upon the science of reading and research-based instructional practices. And I'm so proud to say that we have gone from less than 20% of the student population being able to read at or above the 50th percentile to almost 90% of the school reading. And it's simply because of embracing the science and putting research-based practices in place. So I'm very honored to be on here with all of you today.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Hanlon. Let's go next to Dr. Talley, our superintendent from Martinsville City.
Good morning, Jen, and thank you so very much for the opportunity to come on this morning and talk about the exciting things that are going on in Martinsville City Schools. We in Martinsville City Schools simply adopted for a motto that our students don't have time to wait. We inherited the schools division that was unaccredited for 5 consecutive years, industry leaving, 73% poverty rate total, free and reduced lunch, and everyone said that it would take us maybe at least 5 years to get started on the process, and maybe in 10 we could accomplish that. And the fine staff that we have, I'm glad to have with me today, Dr. Tamala Bond and Ms. Angeli Downing, two brilliant instructional minds. But we decided that we would simply turn this division around within a year. And it happened. And then it happened again. And it happened again. And to much of the success of our students, we're very proud. Our students are doing very well. Very high, just received great information about a high on-time graduation rate, which is essential for young people. Education is truly the great equalizer. And we believe that regardless of poverty, it does not have to impact a student's ability to learn or to succeed. And we just refuse to use those things for excuses. And I just want to say to everyone, if your division is struggling, especially because of these critical times, as Dr. Duncan has said, that our young people have the ability to achieve if we believe in them. So again, I will stop there, but thank you so very much for having us to be a part of this forum. Thank you.
It's only a brief break, Dr. Talley. We'll be coming back to you. You'll be in the hot seat soon enough. Ms. Dowling, would you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Angeli Downing. I'm Assistant Superintendent of Instruction from Martinsville City Public Schools. And I think you heard from our superintendent, we just have a passion for the work we do. We believe in our students, and we know for most of our students, we are the main source of resources. So it's up to us to provide them what they need and make sure they have equitable access to all of that. And it's just, it's who we are and what we do.
Absolutely. And then Dr. Vaughn.
Good morning, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm Dr. Tamara Vaughn, and I am the coordinator of academic interventions at Martinsville City Schools. And we have truly embraced the science of reading, and we are very proud of our teachers and how they have jumped in and have just embraced it also. And we are very excited to tell our story. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Well, with that, let's start. We've got some leaders, so let's start at the top. As we think about taking what we've learned this morning and putting it in practice, right? Not just in kind of the abstract, but across hundreds of classrooms. And as both of you have noted, both areas have noted, with some speed, right? Because your students can't wait. This requires knowledge. This requires buy-in, right, across the board. I'll start with Missouri folks. Can you describe what you've done to support leaders in rolling out science-based approaches to reading and early literacy? How you got them on board,
yes.
How you supported the implementation?
So, I'll try to be brief here, but it's a very long process. When we talk about the iterative, we talk about the replication of this, and developing leaders. We have a very widespread district. We cover 470 square miles. We have 1,300 students in 7 city councils, and we have a variety of people in every community that think differently on every end of the spectrum. So the first thing that we had to do was we had to take an approach that verified, first of all, that we actually needed this. One thing that I think can be a bit of a miscue in some districts that I've seen take the approach on this is the first thing that really had to happen was we had to help our school board understand that they also had to have a sense of urgency about this. And the sense of urgency really has to start at the top. In order for this to continue, because it is over again, it's fine. It is making it happen in one building with one leader who, with Ms. Hanlon, thank goodness, she and I started together, and she was the leader who got it. The others did not. So through a process of starting out with the top, with the school board, and having those conversations with them, the first thing they had to understand was we tested our freshmen, and we had to determine what percent of our freshmen could read on grade level. It was 30%. When the board saw the number that 30% of their high school freshmen were reading on grade level, it really pushed the issue of what's happening with the other 70%. And by the way, what's the bottom of the 70% look like? Which would be quite demoralizing, as you might imagine, for a school board to look at, considering that it's been in business, for many, many years and decades as a school district. So that had to happen first. And then beyond that, you have to continue to look for and have those conversations with and opportunities to try to replicate what you see working, which we have the opportunity to do that. And then what you see is, and I'll be brief on this too, you have some leaders that leave. And then you have to make sure that your hiring process is correct and that your rubric for hiring school administrators includes certain things. 2 items that our rubric really scores high on is if you have experience at the level of leadership, and also if you've been an instructor and if you've been an instructional coach. And then what type of coaching did you do? Where are you coming from? What's your background? In rural Missouri, we don't have the pick of everybody. So we also had to start developing inside. So the other side of that coin is we took a couple of people out of the classroom and made up a new word called mentorventionists. And you can Google it. I think we're the only ones that use it. That's mentorventionist. And the reason that word is used is because we needed to bring in somebody that could help the principals that were in the building at that moment. That would be not an assistant principal, but somebody that would help mentor them and pick up that knowledge that they didn't possess. Well, as it turns out, now 2 of our 5 building administrators were mentorventionists that ended up in those roles over some time.
That's very helpful, Dr. Duncan. Ms. Hanlon, how did that play out at the school level, right? So it kind of sounds like it starts with the school board, developing the sense of urgency, looking at the data and saying we've got to do something differently, and then it cascades downward. How did you bring this message, this urgency, kind of get the buy-in at the school level?
I'll start that if I might, and again, we're still trying to figure out how hear you. Okay. So I think that what I would say is, first of all, the school level for us was very problematic. Much like Dr. Talley, when I started in March of 2016, it was not a good scenario. Morale was at an all-time low, and we had lost 1/6 of our annual operating budget overnight due to the closure of a major plant in our county. So with low morale, the building level became imperative. What we did was, and I'm going to let Ms. Hanlon echo this, we did what we called an archaeological dig at Matthews Elementary. And as the superintendent-elect, her building was the furthest from the central office. And I went up to that building, and we just, we put a tape around it, and we said, nobody mess with this building. And we continued driving and driving and driving in that iterative process that Dr. McGinty mentioned over and over again at Matthews Elementary. And that was where that building, under Ms. Hanlon's guidance, had already had a tremendous leg up. But then it became a matter of, now we see it in shape, now we see it in place. And I pushed in ways I probably shouldn't have to say, now how do we make this happen at every other building in the district? But it happened there first. Ms. Hanlon?
And at the building level, it's that you've got to have a building leader that can be the instructional leader of the school and knows quality instruction, knows the science of reading, and then knows how to put those things into best practice. And it was just bringing constant professional development to those teachers, constant coaching and support, being in those classrooms, modeling what that looked like, not just explaining the science of reading, but then what does that look like in instruction, in instruction. It was teaching them about what types of assessments are we going to gather? How do you analyze that data? How do you then use it? They were collecting it, but how do you drill down and truly use that to then plan your instruction and plan your intervention? And at the building level, you have to have a building leader that is able to then keep everyone going in the same direction. And it's hard work. It's relentless work, and it is constant, continuous work that never lets up. But it's setting, building goals, and then constantly having, as Dr. Duncan always says, the target on the wall, everyone focused on that, and then doing all work to go there. And we had to have in our building a mind shift change. Because there were teachers that had believed in their career that there was just going to be a certain population that couldn't because of their economic level or because of reading disabilities or learning struggles or maybe a history of failure. And it was taking the belief as a guiding belief and guiding principle of our work that all students can learn. And that all means all, and having a growth mindset of we aren't there yet, but this is where we are now and going from there.
I really appreciate that. Moving to Martinsville, I think what Ms. Hanlon said is a really important point. And it sounds like Dr. Talley and team, when you all inherited this sort of idea, right, that because kids might be in poverty, because of their background, that they may not be able to be as successful, and that can become ingrained in the morale and in the mindset. Would you all, starting with you, Dr. Talley, and then hearing from your colleagues, how did you think about leading change? What did you do to get buy-in and to bring about both sort of at the very top and then down to the school level and to the classroom level, bringing about this change?
Thank you, Jenna, and thank you again. We knew, having been here 40 years at that time, having had all my 40 years experience in Martinsville, that our young people were brilliant, hands down. We knew that we had excellent teachers. So we knew that the problem was not that the young people could not learn. We simply had to view them in a different way. First of all, I was fortunate to have leaders who understood that we were not going to wait 10 or 15 years to do this. We were going to do it in a year. It was going to take a lot of pain, some struggle, and building. I think the greatest thing we did was to build a new culture of expectation that we were going to do it. And it's weird, as Dr. Duncan can probably attest, when you go into a building, you get with principals and teachers, and you say to them, everyone will learn, everyone will read, we're all going to do this. And people look at you like, yeah, right, you're going to do that. They're shaking their head, but they're thinking, this guy's got to be crazy. But we're fortunate to had to make some leadership changes. It's not about making friends. It's whatever is best for young people. Made some tough leadership decisions and put everyone on board who agreed that we had to go forward and that we had a short time to do it. And that's critical because you think of the fact that when young people are failing in school, it impacts, it impacts their education, it impacts families. We were very fortunate to have leaders who bought into the system that we want to change and that we would change now and that the old way of doing things would be different. And Ms. Downing and Dr. Bond will get into the nuts and bolts about the things we did because this had to be a different type of teaching. But first of all, we wanted to build relationships to let students know that we cared, to let the community know that we cared, and let family know that we cared, and that this was going to be different. We weren't going to have 7 years of not having success, that every school was going to be accredited, all the young people would learn, and we believed in our students, and we believed in ourselves. And this is like a kumbaya moment because you bring your staff together, you bring your leaders together, and you let them understand that it's all about teamwork and that we're all one big family and all of these young people are ours. And we brought that sense of instead of working against each other, instead of looking at the problems we had, we came together and formed teams, and we looked at what was best. A lot of divisions say it, but they don't always do what's best for young people because the young people are the most important thing in a school division is the young minds that we have because we're molding futures. We're molding family cycles to where they can go. And so we changed the culture and start using real data and admitted what we were doing wrong. And, you have to have that look in the mirror and have that face-to-face conversation with yourself about what you do well and what you don't, and be willing to change. And be willing to change. And I'll let Dr. Vaughn and Ms. Downing come in on that, but because I like Dr. Duncan, I could talk forever about it. But it was a total shift in mind that every student had to be successful, and that we knew even parents weren't going to come rescue us. No one, the cavalry wasn't coming. We were the cavalry, and we just had to roll up our sleeves and do it.
Well, I appreciate Dr. Talley, your own growth mindset, right? So you've sort of been in Martinsville City Schools for 40 years, and yet also saying, hey, that there's, if the data is telling us we've got to do something differently, how do we do that? And I think that's really important, right? Because each of the contexts in which we implement these things, in some places we'll have brand new leaders, in other places we'll have veteran leaders, right? It's about kind of matching the implementation to the context.
And Jana, we can never blame the kids. It's,
Absolutely.
The kids are who we have. I mean, they're all not going to move somewhere and we get a new set. We have to work with the loss of factories, loss of employment, high poverty rate. And so we have to change, and we have to have that mindset, and you need everyone on your team believing that can happen. You need everyone on your team.
Absolutely. Ms. Downing or Dr. Vaughn, would one of you like to add some more detail?
Well, and looking at the buy-in for this specific switch to the science of reading, I'm thinking what Dr. Solari said about using a critical lens. We turn this division around with our data processes. We look at that weekly, and it's administrators with teachers. It's not a top-down approach. And we also do an instructional rounds model where there's a problem. We go in as a team. And again, it's teachers and administrators going in. So what's our observational data say? How does that look when we triangulate that with our student performance data? And in that process, we all realized we had an issue in our foundational literacy instruction. And that was teachers and principals saying, we've got a problem, we've got to fix it. And so I think starting with that why and having a collaborative look at what's going on and what do we need to do makes a big difference. So it was not at all a top-down approach. It was, let's identify our issue. And, you know, as Dr. Talley said, ego's off the table. It's about what's best for our students. And I think that really helped build in that buy-in, was seeing the need and starting with the why. And then I think it also helped too, that to help teachers not see this as one more thing, we actually, Dr. Vaughn helped lead this, sat down and looked at the curriculum framework for Virginia K-1-2 to show the teachers that the science of reading strongly supports and aligns with that curriculum framework. So it's not one more thing. It's the thing, and it's best instructional practice. And our teachers really embraced it, and some of our principals. And we've also had administrative staff from the central office and the school level in the trainings with the teachers. You know, we roll up our sleeves together and we learn together and we move forward together, and that's our process.
That's great. Dr. Vaughn?
Yes, getting to the nuts and bolts too of it, when you asked about how do we get buy-in and how do we get the leadership, it was involving all of them in the training of the, we've gone through the letters training through Kim Bowsen-Brown's department, and just realized that this was the piece we were looking for. We were looking for what is the approach to reading that we need to know. How do students read developmentally? What are the pieces that we need to put in place to make sure that our students are getting the top quality tier 1 instruction that they need? And the way we got buy-in was very simple. We looked at the data, especially our reading specialist data, and we were saying, why are so many students being identified in need of tier 3 intervention? Why are we seeing this, and how can we eliminate that so that our reading specialists can truly work with the students who really need it? Is it an instructional issue, or is it truly a child issue? So we looked at that data, and then we went down and we pulled out the, like Ms. Downing said, we pulled out the curriculum framework. We looked at that, especially the phonological words that were in there, and asked them to be able to define those. And when everything was phonics instruction, but nobody was really looking at phonemic awareness, and we weren't looking at how deep that went in. And so once we did that, we trained all of our K-1 teachers the first year, and we had total buy-in. And so that is, I think, the key to our success here, is that the teachers were so excited not at first, when they looked and saw what we were going to be doing, they were like, ugh. But then once we got into it, and the more they learned, and the more they were just so excited. And so that was the buy-in that we had. And then we actually were seeing some true gains, and the more gains they saw, the more success they saw, the more interested they were in what we were doing.
Jenna, if I might add,
Yeah.
we had a different experience. We didn't have total buy-in right off the bat. And some of you may find that in your own systems. Earlier on, it was mentioned that this is a reading war, which, I hadn't seen those two words together in a while. But we had our own, not so much full-blown reading war. It was just this hesitant attitude. So demonstrating that it worked, we are the show me state, demonstrating that it worked made things change slightly for us. One of the other approaches we had to do was, we're in a district that had been listening to every voice that came along. And I think a lot of times in education, and just like Dr. Talley mentioned, after so many years in education, you just hear everything. And someone mentioned it earlier that people just kind of get tired of the next fad coming along, and you don't want to be that. So we did have a certain amount of proving to do, but then it became a matter of, at that moment when everybody started seeing that this is working, and we had some real results to show, but then it became a matter of making sure, like Dr. Talley mentioned, having those right leaders in place that could actually lead the charge. Because it does get down in the trenches. And it does come down, do you have a building leader that understands this well enough to implement it in the trenches? Because people will close their doors. They will do what they used to do. And we love them all, but that's just a fact, and it's sort of embedded in our education system. So that's something that I think that maybe is a difference for us, is that we had to take it more incrementally.
Can you touch, that's actually one of the questions I was going to ask is, how do you change hearts and minds, right? I mean, I think as we heard, that folks were trained at different times, as both of you have noted, you're in communities where it can be harder, right, to kind of find human talent. And so really thinking about how do I recognize the talent and the skill and the capacity, right, of folks around I know we've gotten at least 2 questions about the professional learning, right? And so knowing you can't just start on Tuesday with, brand new people across the board, how did you think about that? What were your more traditional routes, more of the kind of sit and get, kind of the sessions? And what were some of your mentorventionists, kind of your sort of unexpected or more innovative approaches to professional learning? And then Martinsville, I want to hear about the details of your professional learning too, but let's start with Missouri.
Well, one of the things that we did was when you give the science of reading training, it is empowering to teachers, because I don't know of any teacher that wakes up and leaves their house and goes into the classroom and thinks, man, I hope I work as hard as I can all day long and I don't have any impact on a child. That's not what they want. So as soon as they start seeing that data change, it is one, addictive, but then it is empowering. And the more knowledge that we provide our teachers with, the more then that they're going to go into that classroom and make a difference in the lives of those children. And then it is when they have a question, it's constantly having that system and that structure already in place for them to have coaching and support. And it is meeting with them of what does that lesson plan need to look like? Because our teachers, we had to completely restructure the reading block. It wasn't just, okay, well, now you know what phonemic awareness is. It's how much time will be spent there. And does your curriculum provide enough? And if not, what are we going to do about it? So it's always this if then. If we find this, what are we going to do about it? And then it's meeting weekly. And I cannot stress that enough. It's not having 3 check-ins a year, a fall, winter, spring check mark, but it's looking at those numbers, looking at that data on a weekly basis, and not just saying, okay, well, this is what the numbers say. What are we going to do about it? Who's making progress? Who is not making progress? And what are we going to do about it? And it's taking ownership of that. It is saying, because I did this, we got this result. Because I failed to do this, we got this result. It's owning, that's the one thing that every school must do. We called it at our building, egos at the door, and we're just going to own it. This is where we are. Growth mindset, though, it's not where we're going to stay, because this is where we're going. And we too had been told by our State Department this work would take 5 to 7 years. And in an elementary school, you don't have 5 to 7 years. So we said it's going to be 1 to 3. And it's going to be complete turnaround. But it's constantly being there with that dialogue with the teachers. What do you need? What do you need from me? What do you need to feel supported? Is there something I need to come in your room and show you? And it's never backing off of that support. And the beauty of our story is the same teachers that were having the end of year scores, 13% of their students were proficient in ELA. Those same people then put up 95% of their students were proficient in ELA.
One follow-up there, Ms. Hanlon. So it sounds from both groups, we're hearing a real emphasis on data. And I think similar as a lot of us have seen around the shift to virtual learning, folks have varying levels of comfort with data and technology. How did you not only help on supporting folks around the content around the science of reading, but it really does seem to require, hearing from you all, this ability to kind of make sense of data, and not just 1 or 2 checkpoints a year, but like on a weekly basis, right? And kind of iterating, looking at data, making sense of it, iterating. How did you help all of your educators also become data wizards?
Well, one, you have to have, it's not just enough to teach them about data and what to collect. You have to build a system and a structure for it. And you have to have a culture that is centered on learning. So we actually, in our school, had to take the focus off of teaching and place it on learning, if that makes sense. And I say that because if you've taught for 2 months or 22 years, you know that just because you taught it does not mean that the students learned it. So it really was everyone adopting the mindset of, are the students learning? And where's the proof? Where's the evidence of that? And then what does this assessment show us? So what will I do because of this score? And so now with the virtual learning, the challenge is, how are we going to gather that data? How are we going to do the progress monitoring? Is it going to be as valid? Is it going to be as reliable? And then what will an intervention look like in the virtual realm of learning? So that's been, again, a discussion piece. But the beauty of it is we come together as a team. It's not just this problem, it's everyone's facing this challenge. What are we going to do here? Knowing our students, knowing ourselves, what are we going to do? And so it was, as far as the virtual learners right now, and right now we're also on a blended schedule. We have students 2 days a week and another group of students 2 days a week. So how many minutes of instruction? It's drilling down to actually planning the instructional minutes and the time. And then when we collect that data, what are we going to do with it?
Excellent. Martinsville, that same question about professional learning and really thinking kind of outside of the box on how to support these changes in practices, as Dr. Talley noted, the shift in culture. How did you all think about professional learning for your educators, sort of regardless of where they were and how many years of experience they had?
I will certainly let Dr. Bond and Ms. Downing talk in depth about this. But one of the things we did and continued, hiring in a different format, because Dr. Scott Kisner, who mentored me and helped me so much here, was to have district data meetings. We have data meetings inside of the each individual schools, and then there's monthly data meetings here within the instructional department, and then within the buildings with administrators. I think Angela include that, and Tammy also, with teachers, and we own that data. Our instructional department has done such an excellent job that our students, you can walk in our buildings and talk to our individual students. They can talk to you about their data. Not only the teachers and administrators can, our individual students in elementary school can tell you about their reading scores, what they need to improve on. And so there's ownership, but I don't want to talk too much about it because I want them to get into the nuts and bolts about it. But data meetings, and these meetings, sometimes feelings get hurt. Sometimes, you face the real facts, and it's not personal. It's all about the student. And when we're lacking in one area, we come together as my coworkers are saying, and we fix it as a team. But we don't ignore it. But what I love about our system is that any student, almost any student of all of our students, can talk to you about instruction, what they're doing. They have ownership. They critique. Students can be the worst critiques of each other, more harsher than teachers, actually. They can talk to you about what they need and what they're missing. But I'm going to let Dr. Bond and Ms. Downing get into the nuts and bolts of that. But data, they are a must. You must have.
Yeah. I'll speak generally to the data piece and then move to Dr. Vaughn more specifically to the science of reading. But looking at the data piece, it's just part of our culture. And I think a beautiful piece is we'll have teachers who we use old school chart paper because it just keeps it in front of every one of us. It's not hidden on somebody's laptop. It's right there for all of us to see. So they're in our data rooms, and I'll have teachers at the end of the day who are wanting to get in that room to update their data because they're excited about it. Or I'll have teachers who will call us at the instructional team at central office, call me and say, I need you to come look at this with me because I have a concern. Something's not working Will you come to my class? Will you look at my data? Will you help me know what to do? So that it's that sense of collective efficacy. Our actions make a difference. And when we work together, we can make that difference. So it's not beating anyone up. It's just being honest about what's there, and then what resources, what support. I've gone in and co-taught a class with a teacher who was struggling with something. And I was like, let's see if this will make a difference. And never lose, even in a central office role, don't lose the teacher lens. You have to keep the teacher lens along with that administrative lens. And so it's who we are. It's what we do. They kid me. I have a sign up in my office that says, "In God we trust." Everyone else needs to bring their data. And let's look at it. Dr.
Vaughn?
Yes, and I can completely empathize with Dr. Duncan when he was saying about the teachers looking at something coming in and saying, "Oh, great, another thing." And we really worked on helping them to see that this is an approach to reading and that this is the science of reading and how students read. We created a PLC with our teachers and really worked together as a collective group. We rolled out the training in increments so that it wasn't overwhelming, so that we could get it done on time. We wanted to make sure that they knew that we felt this was important and we wanted it to be important to them. And so that's why we rolled it out the way we did. And we built databases as we went, because we found as we got into it, we needed more information. We needed to look at things deeper. And then we started having those discussions about pacing. So looking at the data, what's our pacing looking like? And Ms. Hanlon, yes, we did have the exact same issues. And we are still kind of with that mindset of, okay, phonics is good and phonemic awareness is good, but we've really got to get this reading comprehension done. And so finding that balance of how much time do we spend in instruction, and that's you probably found the same thing, a fluid schedule where we were trying to reach that optimal point. So we did that, and now we have the teachers. As we were going through the process, we were doing collaborative plannings weekly with the teachers and meeting with them. Some of the principals were meeting with their teachers and having them practice phonemic awareness, practice saying the letters correctly, because we have a wonderful Southwestern drawl, Western Virginia drawl here. And so we were really working on the way letters truly sound. And then the teachers came and asked, because we have 2 elementaries, can we do vertical meetings between the 2 elementaries so that we're all working on the same page? So we saw great growth in the way the teachers were viewing themselves as learners. And I think that was one of the most exciting things about this. And then how they just worked truly together. And then the pieces were coming together, and then COVID hit. But they're still learning and they're still working through all of that.
Dr. Vaughn, I appreciate that, and I love the kind of the references to archaeology and digging, right, in this very kind of learning or sciencey approach to this. Dr. Vaughn, you made a comment earlier about the challenge of identifying kids, right, and that maybe there was some over-identification early on, and really sort of sorting out, for which kids can just sort of good instructional practice make a huge difference, and then which are those kids who have higher needs and really need, a higher level of intervention. We got a question from the audience about how this has worked with your kids with identified disabilities, your kids with special needs. I'd be curious to hear from you or Ms. Downing about kind of this approach with some of our most vulnerable students, what's worked and where there have been challenges.
Well, as we were looking at the data, we triangulated it. At one point, we were only using one piece of data to identify students, and that was the PALS data. So if they were ID'd PALS, they automatically went into the reading specialist. And then we started looking at other pieces of data, and we started using the MAP data. We used the PALS data. We used observations from teachers. We used the DRA2. We started looking at all of those pieces, and our at-risk populations are all within that data also. Our ELL students, our SPED students, and we took note of them, and we made sure that we were looking at their data also, and if they were getting the help they need. Plus, in the classroom, getting the support in the classroom and making sure that we understood that just because a child has issues, we don't just rely on the special ed teacher or the ELL teacher. They're all of our students, and it starts with our tier 1, and it starts with extra support in the classroom. Then it starts with the rest of us who are those other support teachers who can help out and stuff. And we've revamped this reading specialist program, and we've seen great success there, where our students are really moving through now. It's not a life sentence once you've been placed with the reading specialist.
I want to add
Ms.
to that.
Downing, yeah.
Yeah, we look, and if I'm not having at least 80 to 85% of my students successful in that core tier 1 instruction, we're going to go back to tier 1 and see what we need to fix there, because you can't truly identify students for the other interventions if you've got 50% or more of your students not being successful in the core instruction. So that was a big piece of that, and going back and looking at that. And then Dr. Vaughn worked with our special ed department on training our special education teachers in this, and then even taking it to the middle school, training our teachers there to look at it as an intervention for some of our middle schoolers who were struggling.
Ms. Jenna, if I could say one thing here, and that's so true to what we've seen. And but I want to parlay something over to Ms. Hanlon, because when we started our archaeological dig in Matthews Elementary in March of 2016, it was because we had been called by the state that we had a special education crisis, and they were about to come down, and we were going to look really bad. So we had roughly 26% of our student population in the entire district had an IEP. They joked that we had a sign on the interstate that said IEPs are us. Just stop here if you want that. And so what happened since then is the big picture is now we have roughly 12% of our students district-wide with an IEP. So we have more than cut that in half. We started with reading the book, Poverty is Not a Learning Disability, as a team as soon as we started the work, because that seemed to be the case. But I would like, if you did have a second for Ms. Hanlon to throw in here.
So we had on our end of state assessment test, no child with an IEP had scored proficient or advanced. And what we found was that every person who's struggling in reading does not require an IEP. They are not special education. They do not have a learning disability. They actually need targeted, specific, explicit interventions based upon what the data says that their skill set weakness is. So that subgroup of ours, then, we immediately saw gains and growth. And that's what I want anyone that's listening to this that could be where we were. We saw it. We found out that they had growth immediately when they started getting targeted specific interventions, and by changing tier 1. We started with tier 1. Instead of starting with special education, we started with high quality, research-based, explicit, systematic tier 1 instruction. And then that is when students started moving. And then also out of tier 3, we were able to move them from tiers based upon that tier 1 instruction. And then there are those students that then need, okay, this is what they've gotten in tier 1. What's the teacher going to drill down and give there at the small group table, into small group intervention? But then we saw immediate increases too then in improvements in vocabulary, phonological awareness, phonemic awareness. And it's by putting that systematic approach in. And then the teachers still, need coaching and support on that. But we were able to go from 0 students proficient to 55% in 1 year. We were able to do that in 1 year and cut the number of IEPs in half. And now that is district-wide that has happened. And so I feel like they did not need an IEP. They actually were not learning disabled. They were instruction disabled and intervention disabled. And that was on us. And by changing those practices, we've seen the students be able to close that gap.
That's fantastic. I know sometimes, and I wanted to kind of ask about, and I know Dr. Talley referenced this as well, take, sort of IEPs involve families, right? And some changes there, and there could be a concern about a loss, right? And so I'd love to hear from you all in Missouri first, and then go to Martinsville. How do you engage families in this? Do you teach families the science of reading? I mean, as the parent of a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 3-year-old, I feel very welcome to understand and sort of to tell my kids not to guess, right, and to do some of these things. But I'd be curious to hear, maybe starting with your kids who had IEPs, but sort of more broadly, how you engage parents and families in this, and then I'll come to Martinsville to hear from you.
We did bring our parents and families into this. We even had to bring our community members. As Dr. Duncan referenced, we brought school board members. This was an all-in approach by everybody. But you do have to change the dialogue, or we had to change the dialogue with our families. And they didn't even understand, as far as an IEP meeting, they didn't even understand what that was. It was really breaking down the process and explaining each component. As far as present level, what does that mean? And then this is where your child really is. So we taught our parents and everyone in the district to be able to answer 3 questions from John Hattie's research. Where am I? Where am I going? And how am I doing in my progress to reach my goal? And as Dr. Talley mentioned, our students can tell you where they are. So we started bringing students into those meetings and having them say where they are. They've got goal cards and target sheets. And as Ms. Downing said, it's getting those numbers. And I'm so thankful to hear someone else say butcher paper. Ours is on butcher paper too, but it's building a data room and getting that data on the walls for everyone to see. But it's bringing the students in and the parents, which led us then to change how we talk to parents and what information we give them. So the elementary principals, and this has been the work as a team. You've heard all of us say this is a team effort. It's not one person. One person can't do this work. Everyone has to do this work. But it was the elementary principals sitting down and coming up with a protocol. What will we say to our parents when we meet with them? What data will we show them? And it was breaking it down and explaining that. It was unlike anything they had ever heard before. But now our parents understand when we bring that information to them, they know what that means. And so then that changed what they were saying at home. And it's when a student had those goals, it was then, are you achieving your goal? And it was taking the focus off too, changing it from a letter grade to learning. And off of a letter grade, but to mastery. Have they mastered, then it's back to those standards. Have they mastered those grade level standards? And if not, where are they in the process? What can you do to help? But it was teaching the parents of the early learners, that preschool through grade 2, the importance of oral language in the home, the importance of vocabulary, the importance of reading to them, the importance of rhyme, all those sub skills. The parents didn't know that information. So it was bringing them into that circle of learning as well. And now I feel like everyone sounds more knowledgeable. The students do, the parents do, it really is a learning process for everybody, and then everybody feels the growth. And it's been mentioned on here again, but we want to say, because one of our favorite words is efficacy and self-efficacy, and then systemic and systematic efficacy.
That's where it's at.
Excellent. Awesome. That is fantastic. So we'll take those as the last words from Missouri. Just awesome things happening there. Let me just turn, I know I've got pinged that we're at time, but Dr. Talley, any sort of final thoughts on big picture from your educators to your families to your board, kind of insights for our listeners today?
Well, I have to, I'd be remiss if I did piggyback a little on what Dr. Duncan and Ms. Hamlin said. And that brings up a whole new program, but over misidentification of special ed, special needs students, is so critical, because a lot of times they need the tier 1 instruction instead of a huge IEP that you grapple with. But I know panelists, they've been awesome. Every young person has the ability to learn. If we change our mindset to that's going to happen, and we must have leaders in place. We must have teachers and leaders in place, especially teachers, and then leaders in place who can bring about a sense of relationship building and understanding the worth of every student and family. We can't afford to lose anybody. We can't afford to lose a family. Even in this time of virtualness, we have to reach out. We're still reaching out to parents. We have helplines. We're still calling homes. Our staff, and I kind of caution them, my staff has even made home visits, a lot of home visits into homes to make sure our students are still learning. So it is a community thing. We donate books. Our community people donate books. We teach the love of reading. We want our students to love reading more than video games, if you can ever imagine that. But the love of reading, because it opens up, especially the children in poverty, it opens up a brand new world. So our instructional staff has worked very hard as a team to really emphasize the importance, because if we lose them through reading, we're going to lose them in adulthood or before adulthood.
Absolutely.
So it's very critical.
Absolutely.
You know, I would just encourage everyone, don't give up, don't quit. Don't quit on any student, any family. You can do it. You can make it all happen. And now you can't wait. You never have time to wait. Our motto this year is accepting the challenge.
So with that, Dr. Talley, and I'm ready to run out of here, but I hear somebody important is following us. So I want to thank all of our panelists for keeping it real, for just sharing so much information in 50 minutes. And let me turn it back over to Holly, who's going to introduce our final speaker.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys again. I just want to echo Jenna's thanks. It was great to hear your honest and unvarnished take on this work and the ways in which you have tackled it. So thank you so much for sharing your lived experience with the whole group here. So we're going to pivot one last time. It is my honor to introduce our final speaker for the day. So I know we've been sitting a lot this morning, but hang on, because you've got a great conclusion here with Dr. James Lane, the Superintendent of Public Instruction here in Virginia. So Dr. Lane was appointed Virginia's 25th Superintendent of Public Instruction by Governor Northam in June of 2018. And as state superintendent, he serves as the executive officer of the Department of Education and also serves as the secretary of the State Board of Education. So before his appointment to the Commonwealth Chief School Officer, Dr. Lane served as a division superintendent in Chesterfield County, Goochland County, and Middlesex County. He holds a doctorate in education from UVA, a master's in school administration from North Carolina State University, and a master's and bachelor's from his beloved UNC at Chapel Hill. So without any further ado, Dr. Lane, the floor is yours to bring us home this morning.
Yeah, thank you, Holly. Thank you so much. And I appreciate the opportunity to address everyone today. First, let me thank all of the great speakers that we've had today, the experts from Missouri to Martinsville, and to Dr. McGinty, Dr. Solari. Thank you so much, and to Dean Pianta and everyone at UVA for having us. I just truly appreciate it. I've got 6 minutes because I promise I will not take us past noon. It's always tough being the speaker just before lunch, which probably means just another Zoom call. But I want to talk about some of the department's efforts that we've been doing, and so I think that. Someone's going to be driving my slides, so I'm going to actually skip ahead. If you'll move forward a few more slides, I'll tell you what, I'm going to take over the screen share. And I want to share with you a little bit about our data. And Holly, can you just give me a thumbs up that you can see my slides, since I cut a few out with the time? Okay. So I want to follow up on the sense of urgency that we just heard about. And what's happening in Virginia is the data did not call for the sense of urgency at the beginning of where we are. This is our state testing data over the last 5 years. And you can see where, as there have been some jumps and declines, and with English language learners, there was a significant jump due to a rule and a testing change. But mostly overall, student performance has been pretty flat, but it's been decreasing 1% per year over the last 4 years. And so in any given single year, this did not ring alarm bells. But what we were seeing was that there was a longer term trajectory of a decline in performance over that 4-year period. And so we were starting to build a sense of urgency in the Commonwealth when our NAEP data became available, which was referenced earlier in the summit. And you can see here the grade 4 NAEP data in Virginia declined significantly from 17 to 19. We were seeing that 1 point dip each year in our state testing, but it was really when you start to look at it a little bit more longitudinally, you can see some of the concern. And that was mirrored in our 8th grade reading performance as well. So it wasn't a single cohort issue or anything like that. It was across the board decline. And so we held our own summit at the Department of Education, and we knew that we would have an opportunity to come back to this topic in October, and are so thankful to all of the partners in UVA for making today possible. But following our summit in February, we highlighted a 7-point strategy to address the reading declines that we have seen nationally and in Virginia. And the Virginia plan is here on the page. But the first focus is on enhancing the awareness of the science of reading for all learners. Now, I just want to reiterate that this is not all about phonics. Phonics is a huge component of what we need to do, but it is about the science of reading and making sure that all of our instructors are aware that there is a science, that the science is clear, and that we do know how to teach reading. And if we all adopt the science of reading, we'll maximize our students' performance. And this isn't just for readers not passing our state assessments. This is for our students with specific learning disabilities. This is for students with dyslexia. The science of reading is essential to increasing their performance and ultimately their reading abilities. We also want to improve teacher preparation. So, we have a generation of teachers that have come out of school, and we would like to see the next generation of teachers as well learn this science of reading. And so we are working closely with our partners in higher education to improve reading programs so that we're not just in number one training our teachers that are currently in the classrooms, but also making a difference with teachers coming new to our classrooms. This was talked about today as well. We have got to expand early childhood care and education programs, and early childhood has to be a focus. We have to start earlier, and I'll talk a little bit more on that in a moment before I wrap up. We have to ensure equitable access to rigorous instruction. And so one of the major initiatives we're taking on at the department is to ensure that all of our school divisions and all of our schools and classrooms have access to high quality instructional materials. We also have to provide the wraparound supports necessary to support students' education experience. And we've got to make sure that from the state level to our local school board policy level, that we're aligning our policy with the best instructional practices so that we can institutionalize these clear scientific strategies in the way that we operate. But we can't do any of that without a great educator in every classroom. So we have to eliminate the educator shortage in Virginia. So this 7-step process that we're focused on with enhancing the awareness of the science of reading at the top is essential to us. I said I would talk just a moment about early childhood, and we know that there's an achievement gap on the first day of kindergarten. We know that a significant percentage of our students are coming to school not kindergarten ready. And so we can put great reading programs in place K through 3 and beyond into high school. But if we really want to make a difference and make sure that every child is literate and being successful in our schools and graduating with their potential maximized, we must start with early childhood. And now with this pandemic, it's even more challenging, right? We know that learning loss is a huge issue. We know that school divisions are moving their modalities to maximize student potential. But for many, many months, our students have been learning virtual only in an overwhelming number of our school districts. And what we're seeing is that the higher quality remote programs are often in our wealthier communities. And that's leading to disproportionate learning loss for low income and students of other groups. Now, this research study that I'm showing you on the screen did not address the learning loss for students with disabilities, which is also extremely significant. And so we were thinking about this science of reading issue and this student performance issue for many years, but it's been exacerbated and highlighted in an even greater way with this pandemic. And it makes the work that we're doing on the science of reading so important. So I'll just wrap again with a thank you. Thank you to everyone that spent this half a day with us to learn about what it's going to take to improve literacy in the Commonwealth. Thank you to everyone that organized this event, from our partners at UVA to the team members at the DOE, especially Jenna and Holly, and everyone that made today so special. We have a sense of urgency at the department. I hope that you'll join us, because the research is clear. If we follow research-based instructional practices, we can make a difference in students' lives. And if we can improve their reading abilities, we'll maximize their potential well into the future. So thank you for spending the day with us. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak to you, and have a great rest of your week.